Hello everyone! Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. Static Faces from Marcus. The static started small, just a few white specks dancing across my windshield like electronic snow. I figured it was the new dash cam acting up, some interference from the CB radio, or maybe the GPS unit mounted near the rearview mirror. After 23 years hauling freight across the interstate system, you learn that electronics in a big rig have a way of talking to each other in languages they shouldn't know. The Kenworth's engine hummed its familiar 1700 RPM lullaby as I pushed through the Nevada desert, my headlights carving tunnels through the thick darkness that settles over the highway like black velvet after midnight. The static flickered and pulsed in perfect rhythm with my turn signals as I changed lanes to pass a slow-moving sedan. Amateur drivers always made me nervous on these empty stretches, the way they'd drift between lanes like they were half asleep or texting, completely unaware that 80,000 pounds of truck and trailer needed 3 times the stopping distance their little cars required. The static grew more pronounced as I pulled alongside the sedan, crackling patterns that seemed almost organic, like tiny lightning storms trapped between the glass and my field of vision. I reached up to adjust the dash cam, thinking maybe a loose wire was causing the interference. But the moment my fingers touched the device, the static intensified. The white specks multiplied and began forming shapes, geometric patterns that shifted and morphed with hypnotic regularity. The sedan beside me was keeping pace now, matching my speed exactly, which struck me as odd because most civilian drivers either sped up to get around trucks quickly or fell back to avoid riding in the blind spot. Through my passenger window, I could see the faint outline of someone in the driver's seat, but their features were obscured by shadows and the ambient glow from their dashboard. The CB radio crackled to life with the usual chatter of long-haul drivers checking in with each other, sharing information about speed traps and road conditions ahead. Eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 215, came a gravelly voice through the speaker. "You got a four-wheeler pacing you mighty close there, driver." I keyed the mic and responded, "That's a Roger, got him on my passenger side, been matching my speed for the last 5 miles. The static in my windshield pulsed brighter as I spoke, and for just a moment, the random patterns seemed to coalesce into something that looked almost like a face, features emerging from the electronic snow before dissolving back into chaos. The sedan finally dropped back and disappeared into the darkness behind my trailer, but the static remained, growing stronger with each passing mile. I tried adjusting every electronic device in the cab, switching off the GPS, changing CB channels, even unplugging the dash cam entirely, but nothing affected the strange display crackling across my windshield. The patterns were becoming more complex now, forming intricate mandalas that would hold their shape for several seconds before shifting into new configurations. Sometimes I caught glimpses of what looked like architectural structures, impossible buildings made of light and shadow that seemed to extend beyond the flat plane of the glass. The engine temperature gauge showed normal operating range, oil pressure steady, all systems functioning within parameters, yet something felt fundamentally wrong with the truck itself. The steering wheel vibrated with a frequency I'd never felt before, not the familiar road vibration or the rhythmic pulse of tires on expansion joints, but something deeper, as if the frequency was coming from inside the frame itself. The static responded to this vibration, pulsing in perfect synchronization with whatever force was causing the wheel to tremble in my hands. Mile marker 247 slipped past as I crested a long hill, and the valley spread out below me like a circuit board etched in amber streetlights and neon signs. The static suddenly intensified to the point where it obscured nearly half of my forward vision, crackling white patterns that moved with deliberate purpose, rather than random electronic interference. Within these patterns, faces began to emerge with startling clarity, human features that seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent. Their mouths moved in silent speech, their eyes tracked my movements. and their expressions conveyed a desperate need to be understood. I pulled into the next truck stop, a familiar oasis of fluorescent light and diesel exhaust where I'd stopped countless times before. The Moonlight Diner sat adjacent to the fuel islands, its vintage neon sign casting pink and blue reflections on the wet asphalt from an earlier rain shower. As I backed into a parking space between two other trucks, the static in my windshield began forming letters, actual words spelled out in crackling white fire against the dark glass. Help US appeared first, followed by Trapped, and then Signal Boost. I sat in the cab with the engine idling, trying to process what I was seeing. The faces in the static were becoming more distinct now, dozens of them, all trying to speak at once, their features overlapping and blending in a desperate cacophony of silent voices. Some appeared to be truck drivers like myself, wearing baseball caps and flannel shirts, while others looked like ordinary travelers, families in cars, lone commuters heading home from late shifts. All of them shared the same expression of urgent terror, as if they were trying to warn me about something catastrophic approaching. The CB radio erupted with static that perfectly matched the patterns on my windshield, voices bleeding through the electronic noise with fragments of conversations. Day 3 on this stretch came one voice, "Can't find an off-ramp anywhere." Another voice, higher pitched and frightened, said, "The mile markers keep repeating, same numbers over and over." A child's voice whispered, "Mommy says we're going to see Grandpa, but we've been driving all night and the sun never comes up." I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab to inspect the windshield from the outside, thinking maybe there was some kind of electrical discharge creating the effect. But the glass appeared completely normal. No cracks, no moisture between the layers, no external source for the phenomenon I was witnessing from inside the truck. When I climbed back into the driver's seat, the static had intensified to the point where it covered the entire windshield, thousands of faces now crowding the display, all of them focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The truck's radio began picking up what sounded like distress calls, voices pleading for someone to hear them, to acknowledge their situation. "This is Interstate 80, mile marker 215, repeated one voice endlessly. "Family of 4. Been trying to reach next town for 6 hours. Fuel gauge shows empty but engine keeps running." The static faces were nodding now, pointing towards something beyond my field of vision, their mouths forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood meant danger. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, thinking distance might break whatever field was causing the interference. But the static followed me, growing stronger as I accelerated. The faces were trying to show me something now, their eyes directed toward the road ahead, their expressions shifting from desperation to warning. Through the crackling white noise, I began to make out the faint outline of something massive blocking the highway, a structure that shouldn't exist in this stretch of Nevada desert. As I crested the next hill, my headlights illuminated what appeared to be an enormous antenna array spanning the entire width of the interstate, metallic towers reaching up into the darkness like the skeleton of some impossible cathedral. The static in my windshield reached a crescendo as I approached, the faces screaming silently in what looked like absolute terror. The CB radio was going insane now, dozens of voices overlapping in panic, all describing the same impossible structure, all begging someone to help them escape. I slammed on the brakes and felt the trailer jackknife slightly as the truck skidded to a stop just yards from the antenna array. The static faces in my windshield were gesturing frantically now, pointing to a narrow gap between two of the towers, a space just wide enough for a truck to squeeze through. Without the static to guide me, I never would have seen the opening, camouflaged as it was by the geometric patterns of the metallic structure. I guided the truck through the gap, feeling the trailer scrape against the towers on both sides, metal screaming against metal, as I pushed through to the other side. The moment I cleared the antenna array, the static in my windshield began to fade, the faces growing dimmer and less distinct. In their final moments of visibility, they were smiling, nodding their thanks, their expressions shifting from terror to relief as they faded into electronic snow and then disappeared entirely. The road ahead looked normal again, familiar desert highway stretching toward distant city lights. My GPS showed the correct coordinates. The mile markers resumed their proper sequence, and the CB radio returned to normal chatter. But when I checked my rearview mirror, the antenna array was gone, nothing but empty highway stretching behind me. The other voices from the radio had fallen silent, and I never heard from them again on any frequency. I still drive that route regularly, and sometimes, late at night when conditions are just right, I catch glimpses of static beginning to form in my windshield. When it happens. The Reflection Route, from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving nights is you get used to your mirrors becoming windows into empty worlds. 3 years running freight between Portland and Sacramento, and I had learned to trust those silver rectangles more than my own eyes. They showed me what mattered. The road behind, the lanes beside, the occasional sedan trying to draft off my rig's slipstream. What they'd never shown me before last Tuesday was something that shouldn't exist. It started during one of those October runs where the rain comes down like cold static across your windshield, turning the highway into a ribbon of reflected brake lights and yellow lane markers. My Peterbilt 379 was loaded heavy with electronics, bound for San Jose, the kind of cargo that made dispatchers nervous about delivery windows and made drivers like me push through weather that sensible people avoided. The wipers beat their steady rhythm against the glass while classic rock leaked from the radio at barely audible levels, just enough to keep the silence from settling too deep into the cab. I was somewhere south of Eugene when I first noticed the woman in my passenger side mirror. She appeared during a routine lane check, just a glimpse of pale face and dark hair in the reflection of a sedan running parallel to my trailer. Nothing unusual there. Passengers often caught my attention during the long, hypnotic stretches of Interstate 5. What made me look twice was how she seemed to be staring directly back at me through the mirror's surface, her mouth slightly open, as if she were trying to say something I couldn't hear over the diesel engine's rumble. The sedan passed on by, disappearing into the curtain of rain ahead, but something about that brief encounter lingered in my peripheral vision, like an afterimage burned into old television screens. I adjusted the mirror, checking its angle, making sure the reflection showed what it should show: empty highway, scattered tail lights, the familiar geometry of yellow lines disappearing into darkness. Everything normal, everything as it should be. 20 miles later, she was back. This time she appeared in my driver's side mirror, though no car occupied the space where her reflection should logically exist. Just the woman's face floating in the silvered surface like something pressed against glass from the other side, her features becoming clearer as I stole glances between watching the road. She looked young, maybe early 30s, with the kind of desperate expression you see on people who've been trying to flag down help for too long. Her lips moved constantly, forming words I couldn't read, and her eyes held a frantic quality that made my hands tighten unconsciously on the steering wheel. I pulled my attention back to the highway, telling myself it was just fatigue playing tricks with shadows and reflected headlights. 3 consecutive nights of driving could do strange things to perception, turning ordinary reflections into phantom passengers and making empty roads feel crowded with impossible traffic. But when I checked the mirror again a few seconds later, she was still there, and this time I could swear I caught fragments of sound threading through the engine noise, not words exactly, but something like human voice trying to push through barriers of glass and distance, and physics that should have made communication impossible. The truck stop at Cottage Grove appeared through the rain like a small constellation of neon and fluorescence, its familiar brands and logos promising hot coffee and the kind of normalcy that long-haul drivers learn to appreciate during the strange hours between midnight and dawn. I guided the Peterbilt into the truck section, air brakes hissing their relief as I settled the rig between a flat-balling lumber and a refrigerated unit whose generator hummed with mechanical contentment. The mirrors showed exactly what they should show: other trucks, empty pavement, the geometric patterns of parking lot lights reflecting off wet asphalt. No woman, no impossible face staring back from silvered surfaces. Inside the truck stop, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while I nursed coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous geological era. The other drivers looked normal enough, a mix of company men and owner-operators, all of them carrying the particular tiredness that comes from fighting weather and deadlines simultaneously. Nobody seemed to be experiencing visits from phantom passengers or conversations with reflective surfaces. Nobody else appeared to be questioning the basic reliability of mirrors to show only what actually existed in the physical world. I was halfway through a sandwich that claimed to be turkey when I overheard two drivers at the next table discussing Route 99, the old highway that ran parallel to Interstate 5 through the Willamette Valley. According to their conversation, a section of 99 near Harrisburg had been the site of multiple accidents over the past few months, all involving single vehicles leaving the roadway for no clear reason. Professional drivers, mostly with clean records and experience handling difficult conditions. The investigating officers couldn't determine causes, no mechanical failures, no evidence of medical episodes, no signs of impairment or distraction. But several survivors had mentioned problems with their mirrors in the moments before losing control. Reflections that didn't match reality, images of people who shouldn't have been there, voices that seemed to originate from glass surfaces instead of radio speakers or human throats. Back in the cab, rain continued its percussion against metal and glass while I studied my mirrors with new attention. They showed the truck stop's parking lot, other rigs preparing for departure, the ordinary collection of surfaces and shadows that made up the visible world. Nothing supernatural, nothing that violated the basic rules governing light and reflection and the behavior of silvered glass mounted on articulated brackets. I pulled back onto Interstate 5, but the conversation I'd overheard had planted something uncomfortable in my mind, a seed of possibility that grew stronger each time I glanced at the mirrors during routine safety checks. The highway stretched ahead through darkness and weather, its familiar rhythm of on-ramps and overpasses providing the kind of hypnotic predictability that usually made night driving feel like meditation. But now every mirror check carried potential for discovering something that shouldn't be there, some face or figure that existed only in reflection without corresponding presence in the physical world. She returned near Harrisburg, appearing first in the passenger mirror before shifting to the driver's side, then somehow occupying both mirrors simultaneously, despite the logical impossibility of such positioning. This time her mouth moved more urgently, her expression cycling through desperation and frustration and something approaching anger. The soundproofing that normally kept road noise to manageable levels seemed to be failing, allowing fragments of voice to penetrate the cab, not through the radio or any electronic device, but directly through the mirror surfaces themselves. The words, when I could finally make them out, were simple and repetitive. Pull over. Pull over. You have to pull over. My hands wanted to obey, wanted to guide the Peterbilt toward the shoulder where emergency flashers could blink their warning, while I tried to make sense of impossible conversations with reflected people who cast no shadows and left no footprints in the physical world. But 3 years of night driving had taught me that the shoulder of Interstate 5 was no place for extended stops, especially during weather that reduced visibility and made even experienced drivers unpredictable. Instead, I maintained speed and tried to focus on the road ahead, while the woman in my mirrors became increasingly agitated. Her silent screaming, for that's what it had become, mouth open wide in expressions of panic or warning, seemed to emanate from the glass itself, creating vibrations I could feel through the steering wheel and seat springs. The mirrors began to fog despite the truck's heating system, their surfaces clouding with condensation that formed patterns resembling handprints pressed against glass from impossible angles. Then I saw what she'd been trying to warn me about. The other truck appeared in my headlights without warning, a massive-shaped jackknifed across both northbound lanes, its trailer blocking the highway like a wall of corrugated steel. No lights, no flares, no emergency vehicles, just tons of metal occupying space where clear road should have been. I had perhaps 3 seconds to react, 3 seconds to choose between the concrete barrier on my right or the median strip on my left, 3 seconds to make calculations involving momentum and physics, and the particular way loaded trailers behave when asked to change direction suddenly. I chose the median. The Peterbilt left the pavement with surprising gentleness, its suspension absorbing the transition from asphalt to grass and gravel. The trailer followed faithfully, tracking straight despite the unusual terrain, while I fought to maintain control without overcorrecting. Mud and vegetation sprayed from the wheels as we carved a path through the center divider, missing the southbound lanes by margins measured in feet rather than safe distances. When we finally came to rest on the shoulder of the opposite roadway, engine still running and cargo apparently intact, I sat in the sudden silence trying to process what had just happened. The mirrors showed normal reflections, emergency lights flashing in the distance, other vehicles beginning to slow and investigate, the ordinary chaos that follows near-miss accidents on major highways. No woman. No impossible face offering warnings or explanations. The investigation later revealed that the jackknifed truck had been abandoned for nearly an hour before I encountered it, its driver having suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. He'd radioed dispatch claiming his mirrors were showing him people who weren't there before losing control and blocking the highway. Emergency crews had been en route, but traffic delays caused by the weather had prevented them from reaching the scene in time to set up proper. Red eyes and the retarder light. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving a Peterbilt 389 through the Cascade Mountains at 3 in the morning is that you learn to trust your engine brake more than your own instincts. That Jake brake becomes your best friend on those long, winding descents where the fog rolls in thick as cotton, and the guardrails disappear into nothing but black emptiness. I'd been running this route between Seattle and Portland for 8 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics, and I thought I knew every curve, every grade, every trick the mountain could throw at me. The retarder light on my dashboard had become as familiar as my own heartbeat, that soft amber glow pulsing whenever I engaged the engine brake to keep my 40-ton rig from becoming a runaway missile on the steep grades. It was October, and the first real storm of the season had settled over the mountains like a living thing. Rain hammered against my windshield in sheets, so heavy that my wipers could barely keep up, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched the steady rumble of my Caterpillar engine. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant voices of other drivers, but mostly it was just me, the storm, and the endless ribbon of wet asphalt stretching ahead into the darkness. My load of appliances was secure, my logbook was current, and I had maybe 4 hours left before I'd need to find a place to grab some mandatory rest time. The descent started gradual, as it always did, just past mile marker 127. I downshifted from 10th gear to 8th, feeling the familiar surge as the engine compression took hold of the transmission. The retarder light blinked on, casting its usual amber reflection across the rain-streaked windshield. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just the accumulated fatigue of too many nights on the road, but the light seemed brighter somehow, more insistent. I rubbed my eyes and checked my mirrors, seeing nothing but the red glow of my trailer lights disappearing into the silvery curtain of rain behind me. As the grade steepened, I downshifted again, and the retarder worked harder to control our speed. The amber light pulsed more frequently now, and that's when I first noticed them. In the reflection of the retarder light against the windshield, there appeared to be 2 small red points of light that didn't belong there. At first I assumed it was just some quirk of the dashboard lighting, maybe the CB radio indicator, or the air pressure gauge catching the amber glow at just the right angle. But as I leaned forward to get a better look, the red points seemed to shift position, maintaining their distance from each other like a pair of eyes reflecting light. I reached up and adjusted my rearview mirror, thinking maybe I was seeing the tail lights of another vehicle behind me, somehow refracted through the wet glass. But the mirror showed only darkness and rain, the usual empty stretch of mountain highway that most sensible drivers avoided during weather like this. When I looked back at the windshield, the red points were still there, hovering just at the edge of my peripheral vision. They seemed to intensify whenever the retarder light pulsed, as if drawing power from the amber glow. The descent continued for another mile, and I found myself checking those red reflections more frequently than I was watching the road. They had a quality that was deeply unsettling, not quite like any reflection I'd ever seen. They seemed to have depth, as if they were floating somewhere between the windshield and my face, and they tracked my movement in a way that dashboard lights simply don't do. When I turned my head slightly to the left, they shifted right. When I leaned back in my seat, they seemed to drift closer to the glass. I tried the logical explanations first. Maybe it was eye strain from the constant glare of oncoming headlights. Maybe it was a trick of the retarder light bouncing off moisture that had somehow gotten between the layers of the windshield glass. But as another mile passed and the red points remained constant, maintaining their unnatural focus, I started to feel that familiar tightness in my chest that comes when something is fundamentally wrong and your brain hasn't quite caught up to what your gut already knows. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me so badly that I nearly missed the next curve. A voice, distant and distorted by static, said something that sounded like my truck number. I grabbed the handset and keyed the microphone. "This is Big Jake on the 389, go ahead." Nothing but silence and the periodic hiss of static. I tried again, asking if anyone was monitoring channel 19, but the radio had gone dead quiet except for the electronic whisper that suggested someone, somewhere, was listening. That's when the red eyes in the reflection began to move. Not just tracking my movement anymore, but actually moving independently, slowly separating, and then coming back together, like something was blinking. The amber retarder light continued its steady pulse, but now it seemed to be synchronized with the movement of the red points, as if they were all part of some larger rhythm that existed beyond my truck, beyond the storm, beyond anything I could understand or control. I pressed harder on the service brake, wanting to slow down and maybe pull over at the next wide spot in the road. But as my speed decreased and the retarder worked less frequently, the red eyes seemed to grow brighter, more insistent. They began to move closer to the surface of the windshield, and I could swear I started to make out a shape behind them. Something that might have been a face, or might have been shadows playing tricks with my vision. The rain continued to hammer the glass, but the wipers now seemed to be clearing away more than just water. Each sweep revealed the red eyes more clearly, as if something was gradually materializing on the other side of the windshield. I reached for the CB handset again, my hands shaking slightly as I keyed the microphone. "Breaker 19, this is Big Jake westbound on I-84, mile marker 123. I've got some kind of situation here. Anyone copy?" This time there was a response, but it wasn't a voice. It was a sound like breathing, slow and deliberate, coming through the speaker with a clarity that suggestions whoever or whatever was making it was very close to a microphone. The breathing continued for maybe 10 seconds, and then the radio went silent again. The next curve was sharper than I remembered, and as I navigated it, the headlights swept across the guardrail and illuminated something that made my blood turn to ice. Standing just beyond the metal barrier, maybe 20 feet from the road, was a figure. It was too tall to be human, with limbs that seemed too long and a posture that suggested it was watching my truck pass. But what froze my heart completely was its eyes. They glowed with the same red light I'd been seeing in the windshield reflection, and as my headlights found it, the figure raised what might have been an arm in a gesture that seemed almost like a greeting. I floored the accelerator, forgetting about speed limits and safe following distances and everything else they teach you in driving school. The engine roared as turbocharger spooled up, and the truck surged forward into the storm. Behind me, I could see lights in my mirrors now, but they weren't the normal white headlights of another vehicle. They were red, and they were gaining ground, despite the fact that I was pushing my rig harder than I'd ever pushed it before. The retarder light was flashing constantly now, as I fought to control my speed on the winding descent, and with each flash, the red eyes in the windshield reflection grew brighter and closer. They were no longer just points of light, but had developed a presence, a weight that seemed to press against the glass from the outside. I could hear something over the engine noise and the rain, a sound like nails on metal, rhythmic and insistent, coming from somewhere above the cab. Mile marker 118 flashed past, then 117, then 116. The bottom of the grade was still 3 miles away, and I didn't think I could maintain this speed without losing control completely. But every time I let off the accelerator and the retarder light began to pulse, the scratching sounds grew louder and the red eyes pressed closer to the windshield. Something was definitely on top of my truck now, something that had found a way to anchor itself to the sleeper compartment, despite the wind and rain and the violent motion of the vehicle. I grabbed the CB handset one more time, no longer caring if anyone would believe what I was about to say. Mayday, mayday, this is Big Jake on I-84 westbound, mile marker 116. I've got something on my truck, something that ain't human. If anyone copies this, stay clear of the Cascade grade tonight. Whatever's out here, it ain't natural. The response came immediately, in my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. Everything's fine out here. Weather's clearing up real nice. I all have the horn that never stops. From Jake Morrison. The first time I heard that horn, I was hauling a load of furniture through the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning, when the world feels thinner somehow, like reality itself is stretched too tight across the darkness. My Kenworth was purring along Interstate 80, headlights cutting through the black expanse ahead, when this sound reached me through my open window, a deep, mournful horn blast that seemed to roll across the empty landscape like thunder. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, ever since my divorce left me with nothing but a CDL and a need to keep moving. The desert highways had become my home, the endless ribbon of asphalt my only constant companion. But that night, something felt different. The air carried a weight I couldn't name, and the stars seemed dimmer than usual, as if something vast was blocking their light. The horn sounded again, longer this time, a sustained note that made my teeth ache. I checked my mirrors, expecting to see another truck behind me, maybe someone having engine trouble or trying to get my attention. The road stretched empty in both directions, my taillights painting the asphalt red for 100 yards before the darkness swallowed everything. No other vehicles, no lights on the horizon, just that endless black canvas punctuated by the occasional sagebrush caught in my headlight beams. I reached for my CB radio, the familiar weight of the handset comforting in my palm. Breaker 19, this is Freight Dog eastbound on 80. Anyone else hearing that horn out here? Static answered me, the kind of empty white noise that fills the spaces between human voices. I tried again, cycling through the channels, but found nothing except that hollow electronic whisper. The horn came again, and this time I could tell it wasn't coming from behind me, or ahead. It seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, rising from the desert floor itself like some ancient call echoing across the centuries. The sound had a quality I'd never heard before, not quite mechanical, not quite organic, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I'd heard plenty of stories during my years on the road. Truckers love their tales of phantom hitchhikers, ghost trucks, and mysterious lights in the distance. Most of it was just highway hypnosis and too much coffee, but there was always that grain of truth buried in the folklore, the shared experiences that made you wonder what really lurked out there in the spaces between cities. This felt different though, more immediate, more real than any campfire story. My CB crackled suddenly, making me jump. A voice emerged from the static, gravelly and tired. You hearing it too, driver? The voice belonged to someone older, weathered by years of diesel fumes and truck stop coffee. Been following me for 3 hours now, that damn horn. Can't figure out where it's coming from. Relief flooded through me at the sound of another human voice. Freight Dog here. Yeah, I'm hearing it. Thought I was losing my mind out here. You got a 20 on it. Negative. Name's Carl. Been running these roads since before you were born, probably. Never heard anything like this. It's not showing up on any of my equipment. No radar signature. Nothing on the CB except us. But that sound, his voice trailed off as the horn blasted again, closer now, or maybe just louder. I glanced at my gauges, checking engine temperature, oil pressure, all the vital signs of my mechanical companion. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. The engine's rhythm seemed slightly irregular, as if my truck was struggling against some invisible resistance. The steering wheel vibrated under my hands with a frequency that didn't match the road surface or my speed. Carl, you still there? I called into the radio. Still here. Listen, I'm pulling off at the next rest stop. This whole thing's got me spooked, and I've seen enough weird stuff out here to know when something ain't right. The horn sounded again, and this time it was accompanied by something else, a low rumbling that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the floorboard of my cab and into my bones. My coffee cup rattled in its holder, sending ripples across the dark surface. The sound reminded me of approaching thunder, but the sky was clear, stars visible despite their strange dimness. I saw the rest stop sign illuminated in my headlights, a small oasis of fluorescent light in the desert darkness. Carl's truck was already there, a battered Freightliner with Oklahoma plates, parked under one of the buzzing light poles. I pulled alongside and shut down my engine, grateful for the sudden silence that followed. But the quiet didn't last long. Carl emerged from his cab, a thin man in his 60s with graying hair and the careful movements of someone whose body had absorbed decades of road vibration. His face was pale in the artificial light, eyes darting constantly toward the darkness beyond the rest, stopped small circle of illumination. "Been driving for 40 years, he said without preamble, and I ain't never felt anything like this. That horn, it's not coming from any truck I know. And look at this." He gestured toward his rig, and I saw what he meant. His truck was covered in a fine layer of dust, but it wasn't the familiar red-brown of desert grit. This dust was darker, almost black, and it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I looked at my own truck and saw the same thing, that strange, light-eating dust coating the chrome and paint. When I reached out to touch it, the substance felt oddly warm and seemed to cling to my fingers with an oily residue that wouldn't wipe away. The horn blast came again, so loud this time that both of us instinctively covered our ears. The sound seemed to emanate from directly overhead, as if something massive was passing just above the light poles. The fluorescent fixtures flickered and dimmed, casting shifting shadows that made the desert around us seem to writhe and move. "We need to get out of here," Carl said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Whatever this is, it's getting stronger." But as I turned toward my truck, I realized something that made my blood run cold. My engine was running. The low diesel rumble was clearly audible, exhaust visible in the cool desert air, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had shut it down. The keys were still in my pocket, and I could feel their metal weight against my leg. Carl noticed it too. "Your truck." "I know." I shut it down. "The keys are right here." I pulled them out, holding the familiar key ring up to the light. But even as I displayed them, my truck continued to idle, as if mocking the very concept of mechanical logic. The horn sounded again, and this time we both saw it. Not a truck, not any kind of vehicle at all, but a shadow moving across the stars themselves, something vast and impossible that blocked out entire constellations as it passed overhead. The shape was vaguely triangular, or maybe it just appeared that way from our angle, but it moved with a fluid grace that no earthbound machine could match. "Jesus," Carl whispered, and I didn't think he was swearing. The shadow passed directly over us, and for a moment the world went completely silent. No engine noise, no wind, no sound at all except the rapid beating of my own heart. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant, and my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Then the horn blasted one more time, so loud and so close that the windows of both our trucks spider-webbed with cracks. The sound seemed to penetrate not just my ears but my entire body, vibrating through my bones and organs with an intensity that made me stagger. Carl fell to his knees, hands pressed against his head. When the sound finally faded, the shadow was gone. The stars blazed with their normal intensity, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on us lifted like a physical burden being removed. But our trucks were still running, engines purring smoothly despite having no business doing so. Carl struggled to his feet, his face ashen. "We need to leave. Now. Different directions." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Whatever we had encountered, I knew instinctively that lingering would be a mistake. I climbed into my cab, hands shaking as I put the truck in gear. The controls responded normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really driving anymore, that something else was guiding my movements. I pulled back onto the interstate, leaving Carl and the rest stopped behind. In my mirrors, I watched his lights disappear into the darkness, heading west while I continued east. The black dust was gone from my truck, as if it had never existed, but the memory of its oily touch remained on my fingertips. Miles passed in a blur of white lines and reflector posts. My CB remained silent, despite my occasional attempts to raise Carl or anyone else. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, and gradually the passenger who never was. From Marcus Wheeler. Wheeler. The interstate stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon under the October sky, my Kenworth's diesel engine humming its familiar lullaby as I pushed through the Colorado night. 23 years of long-haul trucking had taught me to appreciate the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the highways belonged to us drivers, and the scattered souls who traveled in darkness. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations, but mostly it was just me, the road, and the gentle vibration of 18 wheels rolling toward Denver. That's when I saw her standing beside the on-ramp near Lemon, illuminated briefly in my headlights like a figure stepping out of a dream. She wore a simple blue dress that seemed oddly formal for hitchhiking, and her long dark hair caught the wind in a way that made her appear almost ethereal. Something about her posture suggested patience, as if she'd been waiting there not for minutes or hours, but for something much longer. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, though company policy discouraged it, and something about this young woman struck me as genuinely in need. I eased the big rig to a stop along the shoulder, air brakes hissing their mechanical sigh as I reached across to roll down the passenger window. The October air carried the scent of dried grass and distant snow from the Rockies, along with that particular emptiness that comes with rural highways at 3 in the morning. Need a ride somewhere? I called out, and she approached with a grateful smile that seemed to brighten the darkness around my cab. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice soft and clear with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "I'm trying to get to Denver. My car broke down about 10 miles back, and I've been walking for what feels like hours." She climbed up into the passenger seat with surprising grace, settling in as if she'd ridden in truck cabs before. There was something almost old-fashioned about her mannerisms, the way she smoothed her dress and folded her hands in her lap. "No problem at all," I replied, shifting back into gear and feeling the familiar surge of power as we rejoined the highway. "Name's Marcus. What's yours?" I glanced over at her as she buckled her seatbelt, noting how the dashboard lights cast interesting shadows across her face. She had the kind of timeless beauty that belonged in old photographs, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed deeper than they should have been. "Sarah," she answered, gazing out at the passing landscape. "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. I really can't thank you enough for stopping. Not many people would pick up a stranger these days, especially out here where cell phone service is so spotty." Her observation was accurate. We were passing through one of those dead zones, where technology seemed to surrender to the vast emptiness of the plains. We fell into comfortable conversation as the miles rolled by, talking about everything from the changing nature of America's highways to her plans in Denver. She mentioned visiting family, though she was vague about the details, and I found myself oddly reluctant to press for specifics. There was something soothing about her presence, the way she listened with genuine interest when I talked about life on the road, and how her occasional laughter seemed to warm the cab's interior. About an hour into our journey, I reached for the thermos of coffee wedged beside my seat, keeping one hand steady on the wheel as we crested a long hill. "Want some coffee?" I offered. "It's not fancy, but it's hot and strong enough to wake the dead." The phrase seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, and when I glanced over to gauge her reaction, I felt my blood turn cold. The passenger seat was empty. I blinked hard, convinced that fatigue was playing tricks on my vision, but the seatbelt hung loose and undisturbed, exactly as it would if no one had been sitting there at all. The impression in the seat cushion that should have marked where she'd been sitting was absent, and the air in the cab felt suddenly hollow, as if it had never contained another person's presence. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was seeing, or rather what I wasn't seeing. We hadn't stopped since picking her up. The truck had been traveling at a steady 70 miles per hour down a straight stretch of interstate with nowhere for anyone to go. The doors were still locked, the windows closed except for the driver's side vent that barely admitted a whisper of outside air. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a weathered place called Mel's All Night, that squatted beside the highway like a beacon of fluorescent normalcy. My heart was hammering as I climbed down from the cab and walked around the entire truck, checking every possible place someone could hide or exit. The trailer doors were sealed, the landing gear retracted, everything exactly as it should have been for a standard run. Inside the diner, I approached the night waitress, a tired-looking woman named Dolores, whose name tag was as worn as her expression. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but did you happen to see me pull up just now? Was there anyone else in my truck?" She looked at me with the particular wariness that food service workers reserve for potentially unstable customers in the small hours of the morning. "Honey, I saw you arrive, and you were alone in that cab," she said, refilling my coffee cup without being asked. "You feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine, and I found myself studying my reflection in the diner's windows, searching for some explanation that wouldn't challenge everything I understood about reality. I decided to check the truck's logbooks and GPS system, desperate for some technological confirmation of what had happened. The GPS showed a continuous route with no stops between Lemon and the truck stop, no deviations that would have allowed a passenger to exit. More unsettling still, when I reviewed the dash camera footage on my phone, it showed me talking animatedly to an empty passenger seat for over an hour, gesturing and nodding as if engaged in conversation with thin air. The drive to Denver became an exercise in questioning my sanity, every mile marker and exit sign feeling like evidence in a case I couldn't solve. Had I imagined the entire encounter? Was this some kind of breakdown brought on by too many years of solitary driving and irregular sleep schedules? But the memory of our conversation remained vivid and detailed, far more substantial than any hallucination should have been. It wasn't until I was unloading my cargo at the Denver distribution center that I decided to research the name she'd given me. Using the facility's Wi-Fi, I searched for Sarah Elizabeth Morrison combined with terms like Colorado, accident, and missing person. What I found made my hands shake as I held my phone. The Denver Post archive contained a story from 1987 about a young woman named Sarah Elizabeth Morrison who had died in a car accident near Lemon while driving to Denver to visit her sister. The photograph accompanying the obituary showed the same face, the same timeless beauty, the same gentle smile I remembered from our conversation. The article mentioned that her car had broken down first, and she'd been walking along the highway when she was struck by a drunk driver who fled the scene. The story noted that Sarah had been wearing a blue dress when her body was found, and that she'd been buried in Riverside Cemetery on the outskirts of Denver. The final detail that made my blood run cold was a quote from her sister. Sarah was always so trusting, always believed that people would help each other. She probably would have accepted a ride from anyone who stopped. I drove to Riverside Cemetery that evening, following directions that seemed to guide themselves as if I'd traveled that route before. Sarah's grave was easy to find, marked by a weathered headstone that bore her name and dates, along with the inscription "Beloved Daughter and Sister, still traveling toward home." Someone had left fresh flowers recently, though the groundskeeper told me that Sarah's sister had died years ago, and no other family remained. Standing there in the fading light, I tried to understand what had happened on that highway. Had I somehow given Sarah the ride she'd been seeking for over 30 years, a chance to complete the journey that had been cut short by tragedy? The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be another explanation, but the flowers on her grave seemed to suggest that some stories continue long after they should have ended. I still drive that route regularly, and sometimes I slow down near the Lemon ramp, watching for a figure in a blue dress who might need help getting home. The CB radio occasionally carries stories from other drivers about mysterious passengers who vanish without explanation, and I've learned that the highway holds more secrets than any of us like to admit. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison taught me that some journeys transcend the boundaries we think separate the living from the dead, and that sometimes the most important cargo we carry can't be seen on any manifest. The road continues to call, and I continue to answer, but now I understand that I'm not just hauling freight across America's highways. The mirror's empty gaze, from Marcus. The chrome exhaust stacks of my Peterbilt 389 caught the last dying rays of sunlight as I pulled into the Desert Rose truck stop, somewhere along the endless stretch of Interstate 40 in New Mexico. The fuel gauge had been dancing dangerously close to empty for the past 50 miles, and my bladder wasn't in much better shape. 22 hours of straight driving with nothing but gas station coffee and energy drinks had taken their toll, but the load of electronics bound for Phoenix couldn't wait. Time was money, and money was everything in this business. The Desert Rose looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The neon sign flickered sporadically, casting intermittent pink and blue shadows across the cracked asphalt. Half the letters were burned out, so it read more like DC Ad Ars in the gathering twilight. The place had that weathered, sun-bleached appearance that every truck stop in the Southwest seemed to acquire after a few decades of battling the desert elements. Paint peeled from the main building's walls like sunburned skin, and tumbleweeds had gathered against the chain-link fence that bordered the property. I maneuvered my rig between two other trucks, their diesel engines ticking as they cooled in the evening air. The familiar symphony of the truck stops surrounded me, the distant hum of refrigerated trailers, the occasional hiss of air brakes, and the steady drone of idling engines. It was a comfort sound like a mechanical lullaby that had become the soundtrack to my life on the road. After setting the air brakes and shutting down the engine, I climbed down from the cab, my joints protesting after so many hours in the driver's seat. The desert air was still warm despite the approaching night, carrying the scent of sagebrush and diesel fuel. I stretched, feeling my spine pop in several places, then headed toward the main building. The fuel could wait a few minutes. Nature was calling with increasing urgency. The interior of the Desert Rose was exactly what I'd expected from the exterior. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, several of them flickering with the telltale signs of impending failure. The linoleum floor was clean but worn smooth in high-traffic areas, and the walls were painted that particular shade of beige that seemed to be mandatory for truck stop restrooms. A hand-lettered sign near the counter read restrooms in back, follow the hallway, with an arrow pointing toward a narrow corridor that disappeared into the building's depths. The elderly clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his magazine as I passed. He had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades in the desert, his skin like leather and his eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. I nodded in his direction, but he seemed lost in whatever he was reading, occasionally turning a page with deliberate slowness. The hallway stretched longer than I'd expected, lined with outdated posters advertising truck accessories and CB radio services. The fluorescent lighting grew dimmer as I walked, and I noticed that several of the fixtures had been covered with what looked like brown paper, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift as I moved. The air grew cooler too, which was odd considering we were still in the main building. Desert truck stops were usually stuffy and overheated, but this felt almost refreshing. At the end of the hallway, I found the men's restroom marked with a simple wooden sign that looked hand-carved. The door was heavy, made of solid wood rather than the usual hollow metal I'd come to expect in these places. It opened with a surprisingly smooth motion, revealing a restroom that was far cleaner and more pleasant than the building's exterior had suggested. The walls were tiled in pale green ceramic that reminded me of hospitals or old schools, and the floor was spotless white linoleum. 3 sinks lined the left wall, each with its own mirror mounted above, and I could see several stalls along the right side. The lighting was softer here, coming from what appeared to be incandescent bulbs rather than fluorescents, giving everything a warm, almost homey glow. I approached the nearest sink, intending to splash some water on my face before taking care of business. The faucet was one of those old-fashioned types with separate hot and cold taps, polished to a bright shine. I looked up at the mirror above the sink, preparing to confront the tired, road-weary face I knew would be staring back at me. But there was nothing there. Not nothing in the sense that the mirror was missing. The glass was clearly present, reflecting the wall behind me, the ceiling above, even the sinks themselves. But where my reflection should have been, there was simply empty space. I could see the green tile wall through the spot where my face should have appeared, as if I were completely transparent. I stepped back, blinking hard, convinced that fatigue was playing tricks with my vision. 22 hours of driving could certainly cause hallucinations. I'd heard other drivers talk about seeing things that weren't there during long hauls, phantom hitchhikers, cars that disappeared when you looked directly at them, exit signs for towns that didn't exist. This had to be something similar. But when I looked again, the result was the same. The mirror reflected everything in the restroom except me. I raised my hand, watching the empty space where my reflection should be, then moved to the second sink. Same result. The third mirror showed the same impossible sight, or rather, the same impossible absence of sight. My heart began to beat faster, that familiar spike of adrenaline that comes when your brain can't process what your eyes are showing it. I looked down at my hands, solid and real, then at my reflection in the chrome faucet. There I was, warped by the curved surface, but definitely present. I could see myself in the polished paper towel dispenser too, a funhouse version of my tired features. But in the mirrors, I simply wasn't there. The restroom suddenly felt much larger than it had moments before. The warm lighting that had seemed so welcoming now cast shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. I noticed for the first time that there was no sound of ventilation, no hum of electrical equipment, none of the usual background noise that fills public spaces. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. I backed toward the door, unable to tear my gaze away from the mirrors and the impossible empty spaces where I should have been. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was the sound of a toilet flushing, coming from one of the stalls I hadn't noticed anyone enter. The stall door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, but no one emerged. Instead, I watched in the mirrors as footsteps, visible only as impressions in the slightly damp floor near the sinks, moved toward the area where I stood. In the mirrors, I could see another absence, another space where a reflection should have been but wasn't. Someone or something else was in the restroom with me, someone else who cast no reflection. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the center sink. I watched as the faucet turned on by itself, water flowing into the basin. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silence, echoing off the tiled walls like a waterfall in a canyon. Then I heard something worse, the sound of hands cupping water, the soft splash of someone washing their face, though the mirrors showed only empty air and running water. I grabbed for the door handle, my fingers slipping on the smooth metal in my sudden panic. Behind me, I could hear more sounds, paper towels being dispensed, the squeak of wetness being wiped away, the soft footfalls of someone moving around the restroom. But the mirrors revealed nothing, just empty space where people should be. The door finally yielded to my desperate pulling, and I stumbled backward into the hallway. The normal sounds of the truck stop rushed back like a wave, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of CB radios, the rumble of diesel engines outside. I turned and ran down the corridor, not caring how it might look to anyone who saw me. The elderly clerk looked up as I burst through into the main area, his pale blue eyes focusing on me with what might have been concern or curiosity. For a moment, I considered telling him about the restroom, about the mirrors that didn't reflect and the invisible presence I'd encountered. But how do you explain something like that without sounding completely insane? Instead, I mumbled something about feeling sick and headed straight for the door. I climbed back into my cab with shaking hands, started the engine, and pulled away from the desert roads without fueling up. I'd rather risk running out of gas than spend another minute at that place. As I merged back onto Interstate 40, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror, tired, pale, but definitely there. I adjusted the mirror to get a better look at myself, just to confirm that I was real, that I existed, that I cast a reflection like any normal person should. But hours later, as I finally, mile marker 000, from Marcus Dalton. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, my Peterbilt's headlights cutting through the darkness as I hauled a load of electronics from Denver to Salt Lake City. It was past midnight on Interstate 70, and the mountain passes were playing tricks with my CB radio, filling the cab with static that sounded almost like whispers. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, knew every curve and grade by heart, but something felt different tonight. The familiar hum of my diesel engine seemed muffled, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the sound. Rain began to speckle my windshield, each drop catching the glow from my dashboard like tiny stars. I reached for my coffee, gone cold hours ago, and noticed my GPS flickering. The screen showed my location, jumping between coordinates that didn't make sense, placing me sometimes in Utah, sometimes back in Colorado. Mile markers on the side of the road were becoming harder to read through the increasing downpour, their reflective numbers blurred by the rain streaming down my passenger window. That's when I saw it. Mile marker 000. The number glowed white against the green background, standing perfectly straight despite the wind that was now rocking my trailer. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread it. Mile markers don't go to 0, they count up or down, but 0 had no meaning on any highway system I knew. I grabbed my CB handset and called out to any drivers who might be listening. Breaker 19, this is Big Blue eastbound on I-70. Anyone else seeing weird mile markers out here? Static answered me, but underneath it I could swear I heard something like laughter, distant and hollow. My speedometer reads 70 miles per hour, right where I'd set my cruise control, but the landscape outside wasn't changing. The same rocky outcroppings, the same stunted pine trees, the same mile marker 000 appeared again and again in my peripheral vision. Each time I passed it, I tried to focus on the details, but it seemed to shift slightly, as if the post was rotating to face me as I drove by. The rain was getting heavier, forcing me to slow down and turn my wipers to their highest setting. But even through the rhythmic squeaking and the drumming of water on my roof, I could hear something else, a low, steady sound that matched the beat of my heart. I checked my logbook and realized I should have passed 3 different mile markers in the last few minutes, but every marker I glimpsed showed those same 3 zeros. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. The CB radio crackled again, and this time I heard a voice, faint but clear. "You're in the loop now, driver. Better find your way out before sunrise." I keyed the mic with trembling fingers and asked who was speaking, but only silence came back, not even static. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed everything was normal, but I felt a chill creeping through the cab despite my heater running full blast. My breath began to fog slightly as I exhaled, and I noticed that the rain on my windshield wasn't behaving right. Instead of running down in straight lines, the droplets were moving in spirals, forming patterns that looked almost like symbols. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was fatigue, but when I looked again, the patterns were still there, becoming more complex with each passing second. Mile marker 000 appeared again, but this time there was something standing next to it. A figure in what looked like a rain slicker, completely motionless despite the wind and rain. As my headlights swept over it, I saw it had no face under the hood, just a smooth darkness that seemed to absorb the light. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed harder on the accelerator, but my speedometer needle didn't move. The engine roared louder, but I wasn't going any faster. The figure beside the mile marker slowly turned its head to track my movement as I passed, and I felt its attention like ice water in my veins. I tried my GPS again, but now it showed no roads at all, just a blank screen with my truck icon sitting in empty space. The radio had gone completely dead, not even producing static when I turned the volume all the way up. Outside my windows, the landscape was becoming less distinct, as if the rain was washing away the details of the world. Trees blurred into dark smudges, rocks dissolved into gray shadows, and the road itself seemed to be narrowing, the yellow lines creeping closer to my tires with each mile. The next time mile marker 000 appeared, there were more figures standing around it. Dozens of them in the same featureless rain slickers, all facing the road, all perfectly still. They formed a semicircle around the marker like they were conducting some kind of ceremony. As I approached, they began to move in unison, raising their arms toward my truck. I could feel their attention washing over me like a physical force, pressing against the windows and doors of my cab. The engine began to sputter, and my headlights flickered, threatening to leave me in complete darkness. That's when I noticed my fuel gauge. It had been showing 3/4 full when I checked an hour ago, but now the needle was dropping rapidly. As I watched in horror, it fell to half, then quarter, then began flashing red on empty. The engine coughed and wheezed, and I felt the truck beginning to slow, despite my foot pressed hard on the accelerator. The figures around mile marker 0000 were closer now, some of them standing directly on the road, forcing me to swerve around them. Each time my headlights hit one, it would flicker like a bad television signal before solidifying again. In desperation, I reached for my emergency flares in the storage compartment behind my seat. I lit one and held it up, bathing the inside of my cab in hellish red light. The difference was immediate. The figures around the mile marker recoiled, some of them dissolving entirely in the crimson glow. The engine steadied, and I felt the truck surge forward with renewed power. The fuel gauge needle climbed back to where it should be, and my headlights stopped flickering. I kept the flare burning as long as I dared, watching the landscape outside gradually return to normal. Real trees with individual branches, actual rock formations with visible texture, and finally, blessedly, mile marker 187 appeared in my headlights. I had never been so happy to see ordinary numbers in my life. The rain began to ease, and my CB radio crackled back to life with the familiar chatter of other drivers discussing weather conditions and truck stops. But as the flare burned down to nothing and I tossed it out my window, I caught one last glimpse in my side mirror. Far behind me, barely visible in the red glow of my taillights, mile marker 000 stood alone beside the highway. And though I was miles away now, moving at highway speed with all my instruments reading normally, I could swear I saw that faceless figure in the rain slicker stepping onto the road, beginning what looked like a very long walk in my direction. I drove straight through to Salt Lake City without stopping, delivered my load, and filed my report. But every night since then, when I'm out on the highways and the rain starts falling, I check my mirrors more often than I should. Because sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I catch a glimpse of something walking along the shoulder of the road, always heading in the same direction I'm traveling, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. The road that remembers. From Marcus. The thing about driving the same routes for 15 years is that you think you know every mile marker, every exit ramp, every pothole that could rattle your cargo loose. Highway 287 through eastern Colorado had been my bread and butter since I started hauling freight out of Denver, a straight shot through farmland and small towns that most folks never bothered to notice. But that Tuesday night in October, with my CB crackling nothing but static and the autumn wind pushing against my Peterbilt like invisible hands, I learned that some roads keep secrets, even from those who think they know them best. I was running behind schedule, which wasn't unusual, but the load I was carrying made every delayed minute feel heavier than it should have. Medical equipment bound for a hospital in Kansas City, the kind of cargo that makes you drive a little more carefully and check your mirrors a little more often. The dispatcher had been clear about the timeline, and with the first snow advisory of the season threatening the mountain passes behind me, I'd been pushing harder than I liked through the Denver traffic to make up time. The rain started just past Lemon, fat droplets that caught my headlights like falling stars before exploding against the windshield. My wipers found their rhythm, a steady back and forth that seemed to match the low hum of the diesel engine beneath me. The highway stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional pair of taillights disappearing into the darkness, and I settled in for what should have been a familiar, uneventful stretch of road. That's when I noticed the exit sign I'd never seen before. It appeared in my headlights suddenly, green and reflective like any other highway sign, but the words made me ease off the accelerator and lean forward to read them again. Historical Route 287, it read with an arrow pointing to a ramp that curved away to the right. Scenic byway, original alignment below, that, in smaller letters that I had to squint to make out through the rain, reverse to continue forward. I'd driven this stretch of highway thousands of times, in every kind of weather and at every hour of the day and night. There was no historical route here, no scenic byway, just farmland and the occasional cluster of grain silos silhouetted against the horizon. But the sign was there, solid and real, and something about those last words tugged at my mind like a half-remembered song. Reverse to continue forward. What kind of highway department poet had written that? Curiosity got the better of me, as it has a tendency to do during the long, lonely hours on the road. I signaled right and took the exit, telling myself I'd just have a look and then get back on the main highway. The ramp curved more sharply than I'd expected, and I had to downshift as my trailer swung wide through the turn. The pavement beneath my wheels felt different somehow, rougher, with the kind of texture that spoke of decades of wear and minimal maintenance. The road I found myself on looked like something from another era. Where the main highway was broad and well lit, this route was narrow. The yellow center line faded to almost nothing, and the shoulders crowded by tall grass that bent and swayed in my headlights like spectators at some midnight parade. The rain continued to fall, but here it seemed heavier, more insistent, drumming against my cab with a rhythm that didn't quite match the tempo of my wipers. Old telephone poles lined the road, their crossbeams black against the storm clouds, but the wires they once carried had long since sagged or snapped. Between them, I caught glimpses of farmhouses set back from the road, their windows dark and somehow watchful. This was the kind of landscape that still existed in pockets throughout the rural Midwest, forgotten corners where time moved differently and the modern world felt like a distant rumor. I'd driven for perhaps 20 minutes when I began to notice that something was wrong with my mirrors. Not mechanically wrong, they were properly adjusted and clean, but wrong in what they showed me. The road behind my trailer, illuminated by my red taillights, didn't look like the same road I was traveling. Where I was driving on cracked but serviceable asphalt, my mirrors showed a dirt road, rutted and muddy, as if decades of rain had never stopped falling on that stretch of ground. I pulled over at what might once have been a roadside rest area, just a wide spot in the road with a weathered picnic table and a historical marker so faded I couldn't make out the words. The engine idled with its familiar rumble while I studied my mirrors more carefully. Behind me, the road was definitely dirt, and in the distance I could see lights that flickered like lanterns rather than the steady glow of electric bulbs. But when I turned to look over my shoulder through the rear window of my cab, I saw the same asphalt road I'd been traveling. The unease that had been building in my chest since I'd taken the exit began to crystallize into something approaching fear. I reached for my CB radio, but the static that poured from the speaker was thick, and somehow purposeful, as if it carried voices too distant or distorted to understand. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural areas, but the screen seemed dimmer than it should have been, as if the device itself was struggling against some invisible interference. I considered turning around, but the road was too narrow for my rig, and the idea of backing up for miles in the rain held no appeal. The only choice was to continue forward and hope that this historical route would eventually reconnect with the main highway. I eased back onto the road, but now I found myself checking my mirrors compulsively, watching as the world behind me remained stubbornly different from the world I was traveling through. The farmhouses I passed began to show signs of life, or at least what I assumed were signs of life. Warm yellow light glowed in windows, and smoke rose from chimneys despite the October weather being too mild for fires. In one yard, I saw a figure standing motionless beside what looked like an old truck, the kind of rounded, heavy vehicle from the 1940s or 1950s. The figure raised one hand as I passed, a gesture that might have been a wave or might have been something else entirely. It was then that I began to understand what the sign had meant by reverse to continue forward. This road wasn't just historically significant, it was somehow historically active. A stretch of pavement where the past and present occupied the same space but viewed from different directions. Behind me lay a version of this route as it had been decades ago, while ahead the road continued to exist in something approaching the present day. But if that were true, what did it mean for me, caught between those two states of existence? The answer came as I crested a small hill and saw the lights ahead. Not the scattered lights of individual farmhouses, but the concentrated glow of a town, complete with streetlights and neon signs that spelled out words I couldn't quite read through the rain and distance. According to my knowledge of this area, there should have been no town here, just more farmland and eventually a junction that would lead me back to the main highway. As I descended toward the lights, I began to make out details that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The buildings were wrong somehow, their architecture too old-fashioned, and their spacing too deliberate. The main street was wider than modern towns required, as if designed for a time when vehicles moved more slowly and with more ceremony. And the vehicles I could see parked along that street were wrong too. Not classic cars maintained by collectors, but working vehicles that belonged to an earlier era and seemed to be going about their business as if this were still their time. I slowed as I reached the outskirts of the town, reading signs that advertised businesses and services with the earnest, straightforward language of a simpler time. Fresh Pies Daily. Automotive repair, all makes. Rooms available. Clean, quiet. The neon signs flickered with the irregular rhythm of older technology, casting pools of blue and red light that reflected off the wet pavement like spilled paint. The main street was empty of pedestrians, but I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched from every darkened doorway and every curtained window. This was the kind of attention that truck drivers learn to recognize, not hostile, necessarily, but intensely curious about the stranger passing through their community. Except that I was more than just a stranger here. I was someone who didn't belong to the same decade as the place I was visiting. At the far end of town, I found what I was looking for, a road sign indicating the way back to Highway 287. But as I followed the arrow and turned onto what should have been a connecting road, I realized that my situation had become more complicated. The sign I could see ahead of me, illuminated by my headlights, pointed toward Highway 287, 15 miles. But the sign visible in my mirrors, on the same post but somehow different, read Highway 87, 22 miles in the style of lettering used on road signs from the 1950s. I was The Midnight Mourner, from Jake Hensley. The first time I heard that truck moan, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks through the old diesel stacks at Murphy's truck stop. But wind doesn't weep like a woman who's lost everything, and it sure doesn't do it at the same time every single night. I'd been running routes through Nebraska for the better part of 15 years, hauling everything from grain to machinery across those endless stretches of Interstate 80. Murphy's was one of those places you either loved or avoided entirely, a weathered island of fluorescent light and diesel fumes sitting alone on Highway 30, about 40 miles west of Grand Island. The kind of stop where the coffee was always too strong, the pie was always too sweet, and the stories the old-timers told got stranger with each passing year. It was late October when I first noticed the truck. I'd pulled in around 11:30, bone-tired from fighting crosswinds all the way from Denver, and there it sat in the back corner of the lot where the overhead lights barely reached. An old Peterbilt 379, forest green with chrome that had seen better decades, parked at an angle like whoever left it there had been in a hurry. The cab was dark, no signs of life, and something about the way the shadows fell across its windshield made me look away quickly and focus on finding my own parking spot. The fuel islands were busy despite the late hour, and I found myself chatting with another driver while we both topped off our tanks. Bobby Hernandez ran produce out of California, and like most of us, he had opinions about every truck stop between the Pacific and the Atlantic. When I mentioned the green Pete in the back, his expression changed in a way that made the October air feel even colder. "You don't want to mess around with that one," he said, screwing his fuel cap back on with unnecessary force. "That truck's been sitting there for 3 months now. Belongs to a guy named Earl McKenzie. Used to run furniture from North Carolina to the West Coast. Real quiet type, kept to himself, but he was a good driver. Never had an accident, never missed a delivery." Bobby paused, glancing toward the back of the lot where the Peterbilt waited in its pool of shadow. Story goes that Earl was making his last run before retirement. Had everything planned out, little house in Tennessee, fishing boat already picked out, the whole 9 yards. But somewhere between here and his final delivery in Portland, something went wrong. State Patrol found his trailer jackknifed on a lonely stretch of I-84. Cargo scattered across 3 lanes of highway. But they never found Earl. The wind picked up as Bobby finished his story, carrying with it the scent of rain, and something else, something that reminded me of hospital rooms and forgotten prayers. I thanked him for the warning and headed inside for coffee and a sandwich, but I kept glancing out the windows toward that green truck, waiting. Midnight came and went while I sat in a corner booth, fighting to stay awake long enough to feel human again. The diner was nearly empty except for a lone waitress named Rita, who'd been working at Murphy's since the Carter administration, and a trucker named Davis, who was having an animated phone conversation with what sounded like an angry dispatcher. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that gets into your teeth after a while, and outside the first drops of rain began drumming against the plate glass windows. That's when I heard it. Low and mournful, rising from somewhere deep in the night, came a sound that made every conversation in the diner stop dead. It wasn't mechanical, no engine or air brake makes a noise like that. It was organic, human, filled with a grief so profound that it seemed to pull the warmth right out of the room. The sound lasted for maybe 10 seconds, wavering between a moan and a sob, before fading back into the steady patter of rain. Rita dropped the coffee pot she'd been holding, and the crash of ceramic against linoleum seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Davis had gone pale, his phone call forgotten, while outside the rain began falling harder, turning the parking lot into a canvas of reflected neon and shadows. Midnight, Rita whispered, bending to clean up the coffee and broken pottery. Every night at midnight, like clockwork. Been going on ever since that truck showed up. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in Rita's expression told me she'd already said more than she intended. Instead, I paid for my meal and headed back to my rig, telling myself I was just tired and letting other people's ghost stories get under my skin. But as I walked through the rain toward my truck, I couldn't help but notice how the green Peterbilt seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a darkness that the parking lot illuminators couldn't penetrate. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and filled with dreams of empty highways and voices calling from places I couldn't see. When I woke around 6, the rain had stopped and the morning sun was painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The green truck was still there, looking somehow smaller and more ordinary in daylight, and I convinced myself that whatever I'd heard the night before had been nothing more than wind and imagination. 3 weeks later, I was back at Murphy's, and the truck was still there. This time I made a point of parking closer to it, curiosity finally overcoming the vague unease that had followed me since my last visit. In daylight, I could see more details than North Carolina plates. The CB antenna slightly bent from some long-ago encounter with a low-hanging branch. The layer of dust and grime that spoke of months without movement. The driver's side door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning to walk away. But truck stops are built on unwritten codes of trust and community, and sometimes you need to check on a fellow driver's rig when they're not around. That's what I told myself as I climbed up into the cab. Anyway, the interior of Earl's truck was neat and organized, the way a professional driver keeps his mobile office after decades on the road. Maps folded precisely and tucked into door pockets, logbooks stacked in order on the dashboard, a thermos cup sitting in its holder like Earl had just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air inside the cab carried that same hospital scent I'd noticed weeks earlier, antiseptic and cold, with an undertone of something sweetly floral that reminded me of funeral homes. On the passenger seat, I found a photograph that made my hands shake, despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the windshield. It showed Earl, a thin man with graying hair and kind eyes, standing next to an older woman in what looked like a hospital room. She was smiling, but she had that translucent quality that people get when they're fighting a battle they know they can't win. On the back of the photo, someone had written "Martha, last good day, September 15th" in careful handwriting. I was about to put the photograph back when I noticed the date on Earl's last logbook entry, September 16th, the day after the photo was taken, the day he'd started what Bobby had called his final run. The pieces of the story began falling into place with a clarity that made me wish I'd never climbed into that cab. Earl hadn't been planning retirement, he'd been racing against time, trying to get home to someone who was running out of tomorrows. And somewhere between Nebraska and Oregon, he'd lost that race in the worst possible way. I climbed down from the truck, feeling like I'd violated something sacred, and I spent the rest of that day trying to focus on my own cargo and my own schedule. But as evening approached, and I found myself back at Murphy's for fuel and food, I knew I wouldn't be leaving until I'd heard that midnight moan again. Call it morbid curiosity or professional obligation, every trucker has a duty to help a fellow driver in distress, even if that distress comes from beyond the veil of normal understanding. The diner was busier that night, filled with drivers seeking shelter from a thunderstorm that had blown in from the west. Lightning flickered constantly outside the windows, and thunder rolled across the Nebraska plains like the footsteps of giants. I nursed cup after cup of Rita's bitter coffee and watched the clock above the counter tick its way toward midnight, while around me conversations rose and fell with the comfortable rhythm of people who spend most of their lives alone. At 11:58, the diner went quiet. Not the gradual fade of ending conversations, but the sudden, complete silence that falls when a predator enters a room full of prey. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Rita stopped wiping down tables, the other drivers stopped talking, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded like a warning. Midnight arrived with a flash of lightning that turned the parking lot white as a bone, and in that moment of absolute clarity, I saw Earl Mackenzie standing beside his truck. He was exactly as he'd appeared in the photograph, but translucent and shimmering. The scale that weighs more, it's more than metal. From Marcus Chen. The rain had been my companion for the last 200 miles, drumming against the windshield of my Peterbilt in a rhythm that should have been comforting, but somehow felt ominous tonight. The wipers carved their familiar arc across my field of vision, revealing glimpses of Interstate 84 stretching endlessly through the Oregon mountains. My CB crackled with the occasional trucker's voice cutting through the static, but mostly it was just me, the hum of my diesel engine, and that persistent rain. I'd been running this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture between Portland and Boise, and I knew every truck stop, every way station, every place where the state boys liked to hide their patrol cars. The Cascade Wait Station had always been just another checkpoint on my journey, a necessary pause where bureaucrats in reflective vests would wave me onto the scales, check my logbook with disinterested eyes, and send me on my way. But tonight, as my headlights swept across the familiar blue and white sign announcing the station ahead, something felt different. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m. in pale green numbers. Most wait stations closed at this hour, their gates swung shut with signs directing commercial vehicles to bypass until morning. But the Cascade Station's lights were blazing bright against the darkness, casting an almost sickly yellow glow across the wet asphalt. The overhead fluorescence flickered with that particular rhythm that spoke of aging ballasts and overdue maintenance, creating strobing shadows that danced between the concrete barriers and painted lane markers. I downshifted as I approached, my engine brake releasing its familiar dragon's growl that echoed off the surrounding pine trees. The station appeared empty, except for a single figure in a rain slicker standing beside the scale house, arm raised in the universal gesture for commercial vehicles to proceed onto the platform. Something about his posture struck me as odd, too rigid, like a mannequin positioned by someone who had never actually seen how people naturally stand. My truck's 18 wheels rumbled onto the metal plate of the scale with the usual vibration that traveled up through the cab. I engaged the parking brake and rolled down my window, expecting the familiar routine of paperwork and inspection. The rain immediately began speckling my logbook as I waited for the attendant to approach. Instead, I heard only the steady patter of water on metal and the distant hum of electrical equipment that seemed somehow louder than it should have been. The figure by the scale house hadn't moved. From my elevated position in the cab, I could see him clearly under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his face remained shadowed beneath the hood of his yellow slicker. His hands hung motionless at his sides now, no clipboard, no flashlight, no radio. Just standing there in the rain, as if he had all the time in the world. The sight sent an inexplicable chill down my spine, that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air flowing through my open window. Minutes passed. The digital display board that should have shown my truck's weight remained blank, its LED segments dark against the black plastic housing. I tapped my horn twice, the standard signal that I was ready for inspection, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the darkness beyond the station's illuminated perimeter. The figure didn't acknowledge the horn, didn't move, didn't even shift his weight from one foot to another. I called out through my open window, my voice carrying across the wet asphalt. "Hey, you need my logbook." The words felt strange in the air, as if they were being absorbed by something more than just the rain and concrete. No response came back. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my turn signal that I couldn't remember activating. Growing uncomfortable with the delay, I decided to climb down from the cab and approach the attendant directly. My boots splashed in puddles that reflected the flickering overhead lights as I walked across the scale platform. The metal surface beneath my feet felt wrong somehow, as if it were yielding slightly under my weight in a way that steel should never do. Each step seemed to produce an echo that lasted just a moment too long. As I drew closer to the scale house, details about the attendant became clearer and more disturbing. His yellow rain slicker appeared to be decades old, made from some kind of heavy rubber that had cracked and yellowed with age. The hood that shadowed his face was torn in places, revealing glimpses of what might have been pale skin, or might have been something else entirely. Most unnervingly, I realized that despite standing in the pouring rain, no water was dripping from his clothes or pooling around his feet. "Excuse me," I said, stopping about 10 feet away. "Is the station open? I need to get weighed and inspected." My voice sounded thin and uncertain, even to my own ears. The figure finally moved, a slow turn of his head in my direction that seemed to take far too long to complete. When he faced me directly, I could see beneath his hood just enough to make out features that were definitely human, but somehow wrong in proportions I couldn't quite identify. His voice, when it came, sounded like it was emerging from the bottom of a deep well. "Step back onto the scale, driver. We need to get an accurate reading." There was something about the way he emphasized the word accurate that made my stomach tighten with unease. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off him, and climbed back into my truck. The moment I settled into my driver's seat, the digital display board blazed to life with numbers that made no sense. According to the readout, my truck and trailer, which should have weighed approximately 78,000 pounds, when loaded, now registered 156,847 pounds. I knew my cargo manifest by heart, 26 pallets of office furniture that I'd loaded myself in Portland, and there was no way the weight could have doubled during my journey. I keyed my CB radio to channel 19 and tried to raise another driver. "Breaker 19, this is Big Shen eastbound at the Cascade scale. Anyone out there copy?" Static answered me, but beneath the white noise, I could swear I heard voices, dozens of them, all talking at once in words I couldn't quite make out. I adjusted the squelch and tried again, but the cacophony of distant conversations only grew louder. Looking back toward the scale house, I saw that the attendant had been joined by others. They stood in a loose semicircle around the building, all wearing the same yellowed rain slickers, all motionless in the falling rain. I counted at least a dozen figures, though the flickering lights and shifting shadows made an exact number impossible to determine. None of them appeared to be breathing, their chests showing no rise and fall beneath the heavy rubber of their weather gear. The digital display changed again, the numbers climbing steadily upward, as if my truck were somehow gaining weight while sitting motionless on the scale. 178,432 pounds, 203,891 pounds, 245,672 pounds. The metal platform beneath me began to emit a low groaning sound, the kind of stress noise that steel makes when it's being pushed beyond its design limits. I felt my truck settling lower, as if the suspension were compressing under an impossible load. Panic began to claw at the edges of my consciousness, as I realized that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, something that defied rational explanation. The weight of my truck couldn't actually be increasing, but the scale insisted it was, and my own senses were beginning to agree. The cab felt heavier somehow, harder to move within, as if gravity itself had intensified around the station. I reached for the ignition, determined to drive off the scale regardless of protocol or legal consequences, but my hand moved sluggishly through air that felt thick as honey. The simple act of turning the key required enormous effort, and when the engine finally turned over, it sounded labored and strained. The tachometer showed normal RPMs, but the engine noise was wrong, too deep, too slow, like audio being played at half speed. The transmission fought me as I tried to shift into gear, the stick moving reluctantly through positions that should have been smooth and familiar. When I finally managed to engage drive and release the parking brake, my truck began to move forward with agonizing slowness despite the engine running at full throttle. The steering wheel felt like it weighed 100 pounds, requiring both hands and all my strength to make even minor corrections. Behind me, I could see the ring of figures in rain slickers beginning to move, not walking but gliding across the wet pavement with their feet hidden beneath the lawn coats. They maintained their semicircle formation as they followed my truck, keeping pace with my impossibly slow progress despite appearing to make no effort to locomote. Their hoods remained up, faces lost in shadow, but I had the distinct impression that they were all watching me with intense interest. The edge of the scale platform approached at a crawling pace that felt like geological time. My speedometer showed I was doing 30 miles per hour, but my actual movement couldn't have been more than a few feet per minute. The rain continued to. Static from the other side. From Marcus Chen. The CB radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine as I rolled down Interstate 80 through the Nevada desert. The voice that came through was familiar, warm and professional, with that slight southern drawl I'd grown accustomed to over 3 years of long hauls. "Evening, Marcus. This is dispatch. Got a route change for you, honey?" I reached for the handset, grateful for the company. The desert at night could make a man feel like the last person on earth, with nothing but sagebrush and distant mountains sketched against the star-drunk sky. "Copy that, Diane. What's the word?" "Need you to take exit 247 instead of your planned route. Take the state highway south for about 30 miles, then hook back up with the interstate at junction 52. Should only add about an hour to your delivery time." I glanced at my GPS, frowning slightly. Exit 247 wasn't showing up on my screen, but these older units didn't always have the most recent updates, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. Diane had been dispatching for Morrison Freight for 15 years, before I even got my CDL, and she knew these routes better than anyone. If she said take exit 247, that's what I'd do. "Roger that, dispatch. Exit 247 to State Highway South. Appreciate the heads up. Drive safe, Marcus. Keep your eyes open out there." The radio went quiet except for the occasional burst of static, and I settled back into my seat, adjusting my grip on the wheel. The diesel engine's rhythmic rumble was hypnotic, and I found myself thinking about Diane as I watched for the exit. She'd always looked out for the drivers, remembering birthdays, asking about families, making sure everyone got home safe. When she'd had her heart attack last spring, the whole company had felt it. The funeral had been standing room only, with drivers coming from 3 states to pay their respects. Sarah, the new dispatcher, was nice enough, but she didn't have Diane's intuitive understanding of the road. Sometimes I caught myself missing those late-night conversations, the way Diane's voice could chase away the loneliness of the long haul. She'd had a gift for knowing exactly when a driver needed to hear a friendly word. Exit 247 appeared in my headlights, like a gray tongue extending into the darkness. The sign was weathered and partially obscured by what looked like bullet holes, but the numbers were clear enough. I downshifted and took the ramp, my trailer following with that familiar sway and settle of a well-balanced load. The state highway was narrower than I'd expected, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt that seemed to stretch into an endless void. My headlights carved a cone of visibility ahead, illuminating scrub brush and the occasional roadkill, but beyond that circle of light, the world might as well have ceased to exist. The yellow centerline unreeled beneath my bumper like a hypnotist's watch. Miles passed in that meditative state that long-haul drivers knew well, where time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. I'd driven this general area before, but something about this particular stretch of road felt unfamiliar, wrong somehow. The landscape seemed too flat, too empty, even for Nevada, and there was an odd quality to the darkness, as if it were thicker here, more substantial. My CB crackled again, making me jump. Diane's voice sounded slightly different now, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. Maybe it was atmospheric interference, or maybe I was just tired. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, and fatigue could play tricks on a man's perception. "I'm good, dispatch. Just enjoying the scenery." I tried to inject some humor into my voice, but it came out flat in the cab's confines. "How much further on this detour?" "Oh, not much longer now, honey. You're doing real good." Something in her tone made me glance at the radio, a prickle of unease running down my spine. There was an oddly distant quality to her voice, like she was speaking from very far away. But that was impossible. Dispatch was back in Reno, barely 200 miles behind me. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the road ahead. A few more miles passed, and I began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. Road signs that flickered in and out of visibility in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, they weren't there. Reflective markers that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. A growing certainty that I'd passed the same distinctive rock formation 3 times, though that was clearly impossible on a straight highway. The radio crackled once more. "Marcus? Can you hear me, sweetie?" This time, there was no mistaking the change in Diane's voice. It sounded hollow, echoing, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well, and underneath her words, I could swear I heard other sounds, the steady beep of medical equipment, the whisper of oxygen flowing through tubes. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Diane, you sound different. Is everything all right at dispatch?" Silence stretched for long seconds, filled only with static that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. When her voice came back, it was barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. About the accident." "What accident?" But even as I asked, I knew. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. I fumbled for my phone, checking the date with shaking fingers. It was March 15th. Diane had died on March 15th, exactly 1 year ago today. "The accident ahead of you," her voice continued, growing fainter. "Marcus, there never was an accident." "I'm sorry, honey. I'm so sorry. I missed you all so much. Missed the voices, missed helping, missed feeling useful." I wanted to stop the truck, wanted to pull over and make sense of what was happening, but when I looked for the shoulder, there wasn't one. The road stretched on, impossibly straight, with drop-offs falling into absolute darkness on both sides. My speedometer read 65 m, but I couldn't feel the truck moving anymore. The steering wheel felt loose in my hands, unconnected to anything real. "Dispatch, what's my current location?" I tried to keep the panic out of my voice, but it crept in anyway. "I need highway patrol. I need." "There's no highway patrol where you are, Marcus." Diane's voice was growing more distant, as if she were being pulled away from the radio. "I tried to bring you home with me. I tried to bring you all home. But this is as far as I can reach, this little pocket between there and here. I can't hold it much longer." The dashboard lights began to flicker, and I realized with mounting terror that I couldn't see the road anymore. My headlights were illuminating nothing but gray mist, thick and swirling. The engine's sound had changed too, becoming hollow and strange, like an echo of an echo. "How do I get back?" I shouted into the radio. "Diane, how do I get back to the real road?" Her voice came one last time, so faint I had to strain to hear it over the growing static. "Turn around, honey. Turn around and drive toward the sunrise. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't listen to anyone else on the radio. Promise me." Me. The static swelled to a roar, then cut out completely. In the sudden silence, I yanked the wheel hard to the right, feeling the trailer swing wide behind me. The truck seemed to move through thick air, like driving underwater. I fought to complete the turn, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally got the rig pointed back the way I'd come, I saw it, a faint glow on the horizon that might have been dawn, though my watch said it was only 3:30 a.m. I pressed the accelerator, and gradually the truck began to feel solid again, real again. The road surface appeared beneath my headlights, and I could feel the familiar vibration of tires on asphalt. I drove for what felt like hours toward that impossible dawn, not daring to touch the radio, not even when other voices began calling my handle. Some of them sounded like drivers I knew, others like dispatchers from companies I'd worked for years ago. But I remembered Diane's warning and kept my hands on the wheel and my foot on the accelerator. When I finally saw real highway markers and familiar mileposts, the sun was actually beginning to rise behind me, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold. I found a truck stop and pulled in, my hands shaking so badly I could barely set the parking brake. Inside the diner, the cartographer's last route, from Marcus Chen. The burned map on my dashboard wasn't something I'd put there myself, and that should have been my first warning to turn around. I discovered it 3 hours into what was supposed to be a routine haul from Portland to Denver, curled and blackened at the edges like someone had held a lighter to it, just long enough to singe the paper without destroying it completely. The thing was, my cab had been locked all night at the truck stop, and I'd checked every inch of my Peterbilt before pulling out at dawn. Maps don't just appear, especially not ones that look like they've been rescued from a house fire. The morning had started normal enough, with coffee that tasted like motor oil and the familiar rumble of my diesel engine cutting through the Oregon mist. I'd been running this route for 12 years, knew every curve and grade between the Columbia River and the Colorado Plains. My cargo was nothing special either, just furniture bound for a warehouse in Commerce City. The kind of load that pays the bills without keeping you awake at night, wondering what you're really hauling. But as the sun climbed higher and burned off the coastal fog, that map kept catching my eye, its damaged corners fluttering slightly in the breeze from my cracked window. When I finally pulled over at a rest stop outside the Dallas, I couldn't resist examining it more closely. The paper felt ancient between my fingers, not like the glossy road atlases you'd buy at a truck stop, but more like something hand-drawn on parchment. The burn damage had consumed most of the edges, but what remained showed roads I'd never seen before, winding through terrain that didn't match anything I knew about this part of the country. There were symbols scattered across the map that looked almost like hieroglyphs, and place names written in spidery handwriting that I couldn't quite make out. Strangest of all, there was a route marked in faded red ink that seemed to follow the general direction I was headed, but along highways that shouldn't exist. I should have thrown the thing away right then, but something about it fascinated me. Maybe it was the trucker's natural curiosity about roads not taken, or maybe it was the way the afternoon light seemed to make those red lines glow slightly, as if they were drawn in something other than ink. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my visor, telling myself I'd show it to my dispatcher when I got back to Portland, see if he'd ever encountered anything like it. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just some old survey map, probably dropped by a previous driver and forgotten until now. As evening approached and I climbed into the Cascade foothills, my radio started acting up. The usual chatter from other drivers faded to static, and even the commercial stations began to drift in and out like I was driving through some kind of dead zone. I'd made this run countless times and never had reception problems here, but electronic equipment fails when you least expect it. The silence in my cab felt heavier than usual, broken only by the steady thrum of my engine and the whisper of wind across my mirrors. That's when I noticed that the burned map had somehow worked its way out of my visor and was lying open on my passenger seat. The red route marked on the paper was glowing now. There was no denying it anymore, pulsing with a soft light that reminded me of brake lights in fog. As I watched, the line seemed to extend itself, drawing new connections between roads that appeared on the map, but not on any GP system I'd ever used. My truck's navigation was still showing the standard interstate route, but the burned map was suggesting something else entirely, a path that veered off into areas marked only as empty wilderness on modern charts. The logical thing would have been to ignore it completely, but the glow was hypnotic, and I found myself checking the map more frequently than the road ahead. Somewhere past government camp, I saw the turnoff. It wasn't marked on any sign, just a narrow paved road that branched off to the south, disappearing into a stand of Douglas firs that seemed darker than the surrounding forest. According to my GPS, there was nothing there, just unbroken wilderness for 30 miles in every direction. But the burned map showed this exact junction, and the red line curved down that forgotten road like a finger beckoning me to follow. I slowed my rig to a crawl, torn between curiosity and the growing certainty that some roads are abandoned for good reasons. The decision was made for me when my steering wheel jerked hard to the right, as if my truck had developed a mind of its own. I fought to correct course, but the big Peterbilt rolled down that side road, like it was following invisible rails, my trailer bouncing over potholes that shouldn't have been able to support 80,000 pounds of truck and cargo. The forest closed in around me immediately, branches scraping against my mirrors and casting shadows that seemed too deep for the hour. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead, revealing pavement that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The map on my passenger seat was glowing brighter now, bright enough to read by, and I could see that the route I was following led to a destination marked with a symbol that looked like a compass rose surrounded by flames. Below it, in that same spidery handwriting, were words I could finally make out: Cartographer's End. All roads lead here. My radio crackled with interference that almost sounded like voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood were giving directions, calling out mile markers and hazard warnings for roads that existed only on burned paper and in the fevered imagination of whoever had drawn this map. The deeper into the forest I drove, the more the world around me began to change. The trees grew taller and stranger, their bark showing spiral patterns that hurt to look at directly, their branches reaching across the road like arthritic fingers. My engine temperature was running hot, though my gauges showed everything normal, and there was a smell in the air like sulfur and old paper. When I tried to turn around at a wide spot in the road, my truck simply wouldn't respond, continuing forward as if controlled by some external force that was stronger than my will to escape. That's when I saw the other trucks. They were parked in a clearing up ahead, dozens of them from different eras, some looking like they'd been there for years. Kenworths and Freightliners and Macs, all sitting silent with their windows dark, arranged in concentric circles around something I couldn't quite see. As my truck rolled to a stop among them, I realized that each cab had a burned map on its dashboard, glowing with that same red light, pulsing in unison like a heartbeat. The drivers were still behind their wheels, but they weren't moving, just staring ahead at the center of the circle with expressions of terrible understanding. I tried to start my engine, tried to throw it in reverse, but nothing happened. The map on my seat was burning now, not with real fire but with some cold light that cast no shadows, and I could see new routes spreading across its surface, connecting this place to highways all across the country. This wasn't just a dead end, it was a nexus, a place where lost roads converged and drivers who followed the wrong directions came to rest. The other truckers in their silent cabs had made the same choice I had, followed the same burning trail to this forgotten corner of the world where cartographers came to die. Something was walking between the trucks now, something tall and thin that moved with the measured pace of someone checking items off a list. It carried what looked like surveying equipment, ancient brass instruments that gleamed in the red light from all our maps, and when it passed each cab it would pause and make a note in a ledger that seemed to be bound in leather the color of charcoal. I knew with absolute certainty that it was the one who had drawn all these maps, scattered them across truck stops and rest areas like seeds, waiting for curious drivers to pick them up and follow them home. The terrible thing was that part of me understood why. There was something beautiful about this place, something that made perfect sense once you accepted that not all roads lead where you expect them to. The other drivers weren't prisoners exactly. They were participants in some vast mapping project that required willing subjects, volunteers, who would drive the lonely highways forever, creating new routes between the spaces where normal roads feared to go. Their trucks would become part of the legend, ghost rigs seen on dark highways, leading other drivers to make the same choice I was facing now. But I wasn't ready to become a legend, wasn't ready to join that silent circle of cartographers. When the tall figure approached my truck, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the burning map and held it against my window, pressing the hot paper against the glass, until something gave way, until the red light flared bright enough to blind even that patient surveyor. The world around me cracked like broken glass, the forest and the other trucks, and that terrible clearing all fragmenting into pieces that scattered on a wind that smelled like diesel fuel and freedom. I found myself back on the interstate, my truck rolling normally down the familiar highway toward Denver. My radio was working again, full of the usual chatter from other drivers, and the red receipt. From Marcus Chen. The toll booth appeared in my headlights like a forgotten relic from another era, its weathered wooden frame standing incongruously beside the modern interstate that stretched endlessly through the Nevada desert. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, hauling freight from Los Angeles to Denver, and I could have sworn on my mother's grave that there had never been a toll station here before. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a steady 3:47 a.m., and the gentle rumble of my Peterbilt's engine was the only sound cutting through the desert silence. I eased off the accelerator, my air brakes hissing softly as the massive rig began to slow. The toll booth stood beneath a single flickering streetlight that cast dancing shadows across the cracked asphalt, and I noticed with growing unease that there were no other lanes, no bypass route, nothing but a narrow passage that forced every vehicle to stop. A faded wooden sign hung crooked above the booth, its paint so weathered that I had to squint through my windshield to make out the words carved into the wood itself rather than painted on: blood toll, passage fee required. The booth itself seemed to have been constructed from materials that belonged to different decades entirely. The lower half appeared to be made of stones fitted together with mortar that had long since begun to crumble, while the upper portion was comprised of rough-hewn logs that looked like they'd been salvaged from an old frontier settlement. A single window faced the road, but the glass was so dark and reflective that it seemed more like a black mirror than anything meant for looking through. As I drew closer, I could see that what I had initially mistaken for modern electrical fixtures were actually old-fashioned oil lanterns, their flames dancing behind sooty glass chimneys. I pulled my rig to a stop beside the booth, leaving the engine idling as I rolled down my window. The desert air that rushed in carried an oddly metallic scent, like copper pennies left too long in the sun, mixed with something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of the butcher shop where my grandfather used to work when I was a child. The silence beyond my truck's engine seemed unnaturally complete, as if even the usual desert sounds of insects and distant coyotes had been swallowed by whatever presence inhabited this strange place. For several long moments, nothing happened. The dark window of the toll booth remained impenetrable, and I began to wonder if the entire structure was abandoned, some elaborate prank or art installation that some eccentric millionaire had erected in the middle of nowhere. I was just considering putting the truck back in gear and attempting to drive around the barrier when the window suddenly slid open with a grinding sound like stone against stone. What emerged from the darkness within was a hand, but calling it simply a hand seemed inadequate to describe what I was seeing. The flesh was pale to the point of being nearly translucent, and I could see dark veins running beneath the skin like rivers on a map. The fingers were unnaturally long, ending in what appeared to be fingernails that had grown far beyond any reasonable length, curving slightly like talons. The hand moved with a fluid grace that seemed somehow wrong, as if it were moving through water rather than air. A voice followed the hand, emerging from the depths of the booth with the dry rasp of wind through autumn leaves. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating not just in my ears, but somehow in my chest cavity, as if my entire body were being used as a sound chamber. "Welcome, traveler," the voice said, each word drawn out like a sigh. "The road ahead requires payment. The toll must be paid in blood." I felt my mouth go dry, and I had to swallow twice before I could find my voice. "Blood?" I managed to croak out, my hands instinctively tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't understand. I can pay cash or credit card or whatever electronic payment system you use. I've got my Easy Pass transponder right here on the dashboard." The pale hand moved in what might have been a dismissive gesture, those strange elongated fingers curling and uncurling hypnotically. Currency of flesh and bone holds no value here, the voice continued, and I noticed that I could see no breath condensation in the cool desert air, no sign that whatever was speaking was actually breathing. The old roads remember the old ways. Blood calls to blood, life pays for passage, and the journey continues for those willing to make the sacrifice. I stared at the hand, my mind struggling to process what I was being told. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke, maybe something being filmed for a television show or a viral video. I glanced around, looking for hidden cameras or film crews, but saw nothing except the endless dark desert stretching away in all directions. The stars overhead seemed dimmer than they should have been, as if something in the atmosphere were filtering out their light. "I'm not giving you any blood," I said, trying to inject some authority into my voice, despite the tremor I could hear creeping in around the edges. "That's insane. I'm going to turn around and find another route." But even as I said it, I was looking in my mirrors and realizing that turning a fully loaded 18-wheeler around on this narrow strip of road would be nearly impossible. I would need to back up for at least a mile before I found a spot wide enough to attempt a turnaround, and something deep in my gut told me that backing away from this place in the dark would be far more dangerous than whatever lay ahead. The hand withdrew slightly, disappearing into the shadows of the booth's interior, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope that whoever or whatever was inside had given up and would simply raise the barrier to let me pass. Instead, what emerged was something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a small device that looked like it might have been a medical instrument, all gleaming metal and sharp edges, but there was something organic about its construction, as if it had been grown rather than manufactured. "Just a small cut," the voice whispered, and now it seemed to be coming from inside my own head rather than from the booth. "A few drops to satisfy the old covenant. The road has been thirsty for so very long, and your blood sings with the strength of many miles traveled. Such a small price for safe passage through the darkness." I could feel a strange compulsion creeping over me, a drowsy acceptance that seemed to be emanating from the device itself. My left hand actually began to rise from the steering wheel, moving toward the window as if it no longer belonged to me. The metal instrument gleamed in the flickering lamplight, and I could see that its edge was sharp enough to part flesh with barely a whisper of contact. It was the sudden blast of an air horn from somewhere behind me that broke the spell. I jerked my hand back and twisted in my seat to look in my mirrors, seeing headlights approaching fast from the direction I'd come. Another truck, probably another long-haul driver making the same run I'd been making for years, and suddenly I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. The approaching truck slowed as it neared the toll booth, and I could see through its windshield that the driver was an older woman, with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked confused but not particularly frightened, probably wondering why traffic had stopped in the middle of nowhere. As her truck came to a stop behind mine, she rolled down her window and called out, "Everything okay up there?" The pale hand had vanished back into the booth, and when I looked toward the dark window, I could see nothing but my own reflection staring back at me with wide, frightened eyes. "There's something wrong with this toll booth," I called back to her. "The operator is asking for payment in blood." The woman's expression shifted from confusion to concern, and she reached for what I assumed was her CB radio. "I'm calling this in," she shouted. "This sounds like some kind of robbery attempt or worse." But before she could complete her call, the barrier across the road began to rise with a grinding mechanical sound that seemed to go on far longer than it should have. The dark window of the booth slid shut with the same stone-on-stone grinding I'd heard before, and the oil lamps began to dim until only the faintest glow remained. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I put the truck in gear and accelerated through the opening, my trailer clearing the barrier with inches to spare. In my mirrors, I watched the other truck follow close behind, both of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever we'd encountered. We drove in convoy for the next 100 miles, occasionally checking in with each other on the CB radio, but neither of us spoke directly about what had happened at the toll booth. What was there to say? That we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that belonged to an older and darker world than the one we thought we knew. As the sun began to rise over the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. The other driver had taken the endless mile marker from Jake Morrison. The thing about Interstate 94 between Minneapolis and Fargo is that it stretches like a black ribbon through farmland so empty you start to wonder if the world just stops existing beyond the reach of your headlights. I'd been driving this route for 16 years, hauling everything from refrigerated goods to furniture, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every overpass, every quirky billboard between here and there. The highway held no mysteries for me anymore, or so I believed until that October night when the darkness decided it didn't want to let me go. I had left the Twin Cities around 11:30, running behind schedule because of a delayed pickup at the warehouse. My rig, a 2019 Peterbilt 579 that I'd named Stella after my ex-wife's sister, hummed steadily beneath me as we carved through the night. The weather was clear, temperature hovering around 45 degrees, and I had a decent load of electronics heading to a distribution center in North Dakota. Everything felt routine, comfortable even, the way long-haul nights get when your body settles into the rhythm of road vibrations and the steady drone of 18 wheels eating up asphalt. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came around what should have been mile marker 87, just past Sauk Center. I'd passed this stretch thousands of times, knew it like the back of my weathered hands, but when I glanced at my GPS, it showed me still being at mile 85. I figured it was just a glitch in the satellite reception, maybe interference from the heavy cloud cover that had started rolling in from the west. Technology fails, especially out here where cell towers are sparse and the landscape swallows radio signals like a hungry mouth. But then I passed mile marker 85 again, and again. The white rectangular signs kept appearing in my headlight beams with mechanical regularity, each one declaring the exact same number in reflective letters that seemed to glow with an unnatural persistence. At first, I thought maybe the highway department had made some kind of clerical error, put up duplicate signs or forgotten to remove old ones. But as the miles accumulated on my odometer without the marker numbers changing, a cold awareness began seeping into my chest like ice water. I tried radioing other drivers on Channel 19, the familiar crackle of CB static filling Stella's cab as I keyed the microphone. Breaker 19, this is northbound Jake heading toward Fargo on 94. Anybody copy? Nothing but white noise and the occasional pop of distant interference. I adjusted the squelch and tried again, my voice betraying just a hint of the unease that was starting to coil in my stomach like a snake. Still, nothing. The radio waves that usually carried the voices of fellow truckers, complaints about traffic, warnings about Smokey Bears, and late-night confessions to the darkness had gone completely silent. The landscape outside hadn't changed either, and that's when the real fear began to set in. The same cluster of silos appeared on my right, 3 silver towers catching my headlights exactly as they had 20 minutes earlier. The same abandoned farmhouse with its sagging porch and broken windows materialized from the darkness and disappeared again into my mirrors. A red barn with a faded mail pouch tobacco advertisement painted on its side kept reappearing like a recurring dream that refuses to fade with morning light. I pulled over at the next rest area, a simple 2-lane loop with picnic tables and a brick restroom building that the state maintained. My hands were shaking slightly as I killed the engine, and Stella settled with her usual series of mechanical sighs and cooling metal pings. The silence that followed was absolute, not the normal quiet of rural Minnesota at 2 in the morning, but something deeper, more complete, as if the world had been wrapped in thick cotton that absorbed every sound. Walking around my truck, I checked the tires, the fifth wheel connection, the trailer doors, anything to convince myself that this was just fatigue playing tricks on my perception. The air smelled wrong too, not like the usual mixture of farmland and distant grain elevators, but sterile somehow, like the recycled atmosphere inside a windowless building. No crickets chirped from the grass, No distant highway noise carried on the wind. Even my footsteps on the gravel seemed muffled, as if the sound was being stolen away before it could properly form. When I climbed back into the cab and fired up Stella's engine, the dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m., exactly the same time it had shown when I'd first noticed the mile marker problem. I stared at the digital display, watched the seconds that should have been ticking by remain frozen in amber numbers. My fuel gauge hadn't moved either, still showing 3/4 full, despite the 100+ miles I'd supposedly covered since my last fill-up in Minneapolis. Back on the highway, the pattern continued with mechanical precision. Mile marker 85 appeared in my headlights like a faithful dog returning home, its reflective surface catching the light with that same unnatural brightness. The silos, the farmhouse, the red barn, all of them cycling past in their predetermined order as if I was driving through some vast, elaborate movie set designed to create the illusion of forward progress while keeping me trapped in one endless loop of asphalt and painted lines. I tried every escape route I could think of, side roads that led into the darkness and curved back to deposit me right back onto westbound 94 at the exact same spot. On-ramps that spiraled up from nowhere and merged into traffic that consisted only of my single truck. Even driving backwards, hazard lights flashing as I crept along the shoulder in reverse, only resulted in mile marker 85 appearing again, this time approaching from what should have been the wrong direction. The fuel gauge began to bother me more than anything else. In my years of driving, I'd developed an almost supernatural awareness of diesel consumption, could calculate my remaining range down to the last gallon based on engine sound and road conditions. But Stella's tank remained stubbornly 3/4 full no matter how many impossible miles we covered, as if the truck was running on something other than the fuel I'd paid for at that Flying J back in the real world. That's when I started to understand what was happening, or at least accept it in the way you accept a nightmare even while knowing it makes no logical sense. I was caught in a loop. A single stretch of Interstate 94 that had somehow separated itself from the normal flow of time and distance, the mile marker, the landmarks, the empty roads stretching endlessly ahead and behind. All of it was real, but existed in a space that had been carved out from the regular geography of Minnesota farmland. Dawn should have started breaking around 6:30, the eastern horizon showing that first pale hint of approaching sunrise that truckers learned to anticipate like clockwork. But the darkness remained absolute. Not even the slightest suggestion of morning light creeping into the sky. My dashboard clock still read 2:17 a.m. and I began to wonder if sunrise would ever come again, or if I was destined to drive this same 17-mile stretch of highway until my real fuel ran out, or my mind finally snapped under the weight of impossible repetition. The CB radio crackled suddenly, making me jump so hard I nearly swerved into the median. A voice emerged from the static, distant and distorted but unmistakably human. "Northbound Jake, this is eastbound Eddie. You copy?" I grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it in my excitement to make contact with another consciousness. "Eddie, this is Jake. Thank God you're out there. I'm stuck in some kind of loop on 94. Can't get past mile marker 85. Been driving for hours without making any real progress." The words tumbled out of me in a rush, desperate to share this impossible situation with someone who might understand or help. "Affirmative, Jake. I copy your situation. Been watching you pass the same spots for the last 4 hours. You need to listen carefully now. When you see the red barn coming up, that mail pouch sign, you need to close your eyes and count to 10. Don't ask me why, just do it. Sometimes the road gets confused, forgets which direction leads forward and which leads back. Closing your eyes helps reset the navigation." It sounded completely insane, but insanity had become relative somewhere around the 15th time I'd passed those silver silos. When the red barn appeared in my headlights again, its faded tobacco advertisement clearly visible, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, continuing to steer straight while counting slowly to 10. Stella's engine note remained steady, road vibrations unchanged, but something in the air itself seemed to shift, like the moment right before a thunderstorm when atmospheric pressure drops and you can feel electricity building in your bones. When I opened my eyes, mile marker 86 was sliding past my passenger window. Then 87. The landscape began changing again, new farms and different buildings appearing in the darkness ahead. My dashboard clock jumped suddenly to 6:45 a.m., and the eastern horizon showed the first pale streaks of approaching dawn. The CB radio had gone silent again, but I didn't care because I was the lights that follow no road. From Marcus. The stretch of Highway 34 between Millfield and Carson has always been one of those roads that truck drivers either love or avoid completely. I've been hauling freight for 17 years now, and I fall somewhere in the middle on that particular piece of asphalt. The road itself isn't bad, smooth enough and well maintained, cutting through rolling farmland that looks peaceful in daylight. But at night, especially on moonless nights like the one I'm telling you about, Highway 34 takes on a different personality altogether. It was past 2 in the morning when I spotted the headlights in my side mirror. I was driving my Peterbilt 379, loaded down with agricultural equipment, bound for a dealer in Carson, and I had been making good time despite the light rain that had been falling since midnight. The wipers kept a steady rhythm against my windshield, and the radio played softly, keeping me company through the quiet hours. I'd seen maybe 3 other vehicles in the past hour, which was typical for this route at this time of night. The headlights appeared suddenly, bright white beams cutting through the darkness about a quarter mile behind me. They were positioned oddly, sitting lower than I'd expect for a car, but not quite right for a truck either. The spacing seemed off, too, closer together than normal headlights should be. I adjusted my side mirror to get a better look, but the rain and darkness made it difficult to make out the vehicle they belonged to. What struck me as strange was how steady they remained. Most drivers, especially at this hour, have some natural sway to their driving, minor corrections and adjustments that cause their headlights to drift slightly left or right. These lights held perfectly steady, maintaining the exact same distance behind me, mile after mile. They weren't gaining on me, but they weren't falling back either, just holding that precise quarter-mile gap, like they were tethered to my truck by an invisible rope. I pressed the accelerator slightly, bringing my speed up from 65 to 70. The lights maintained their distance. I eased back down to 60, and still they held that same gap. The consistency was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put into words. It was like being watched by something that never blinked. The farmland around us stretched away into darkness on both sides, broken occasionally by the distant glow of a farmhouse window or the skeletal outline of a grain silo against the clouded sky. The rain continued its gentle percussion on my cab, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the low rumble of thunder, though I couldn't see any lightning. The whole scene felt isolated and somehow fragile, as if we were the only points of light in an ocean of darkness. I tried raising other drivers on the CB radio, but got nothing except static. Channel 19 was dead quiet, which was unusual even for this time of night. Usually there's at least some chatter, someone else fighting sleep or loneliness on the long haul. The silence felt thick and oppressive, broken only by the steady hum of my engine and the whisper of tires on wet pavement. After about 20 minutes of this strange convoy, I decided to get a better look at my follower. There was a truck stop coming up in about 5 miles, a place called Mel's that stayed open all night for drivers like me. I figured I'd pull in, see what this other driver was up to, maybe grab a coffee and stretch my legs. The rain was starting to ease up, and I was curious more than concerned at that point. I flipped on my turn signal and began to slow down as the truck stop's neon sign came into view through the drizzle. The blue and red letters spelling out Mel's 24-hour flickered slightly, casting wavering colors across the wet pavement of the parking lot. As I made the turn into the lot, I glanced in my mirror to see if the other vehicle would follow. That's when I got my first real chill of the night. The headlights continued straight down the highway. They didn't slow, didn't signal, just maintained their steady pace and disappeared around the next curve. But here's what made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. As they passed the truck stop entrance, I could see the patch of highway they illuminated, and there was nothing there. No vehicle, no shadow, no shape of any kind. Just two perfectly round circles of brilliant white light moving down the road, with nothing to cast them. I sat in my idling truck for several minutes, staring out at the empty highway and trying to process what I'd just seen. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the rain, or perhaps another vehicle's lights reflecting off something I couldn't see. But the feeling in my gut told a different story. That cold, primitive part of the brain that kept our ancestors alive was sending up warning flares. I went inside Mel's and ordered coffee from a tired-looking woman behind the counter. The place was nearly empty except for one other driver in a back booth and an elderly man reading a newspaper at the counter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the back a radio played country music at low volume. It all felt comfortingly normal after what I'd just witnessed on the highway. I asked the woman if she'd seen any unusual traffic tonight, but she just shrugged and said it had been quiet. The other driver looked up when I mentioned the strange lights, though. He was a heavyset man with graying hair, wearing a baseball cap with a feed company logo. "You see them too?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this wasn't the first time the subject had come up. Been hearing stories about those lights for maybe 6 months now. Always the same description. Headlights with no vehicle, following drivers, on this stretch of 34. He took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window toward the highway. "Most folks don't like to talk about it. Bad for business, you know, but drivers talk to each other." He told me about a woman who'd reported the lights following her from Millfield all the way to Carson, maintaining that same steady distance the entire 60-mile stretch. Another driver claimed he'd pulled over and watched them pass, insisting he could see right through where a vehicle should have been. The stories were consistent, always the same section of highway, always between midnight and dawn, and always the same behavior pattern of following at a distance. I finished my coffee and headed back to my truck, checking my phone for the time. I'd been inside for nearly an hour, and I needed to get back on the road if I was going to make my delivery on schedule. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the air clean and cool. Stars were becoming visible through breaks in the clouds, and the highway stretched away into the distance, empty and wet under the truck stop's lights. I pulled back onto Highway 34 and settled into my seat, adjusting my mirrors and checking my gauges. The next 40 miles to Carson should be straightforward, and I found myself hoping the rest of the trip would be uneventful. The coffee had helped shake off some of the unease from my earlier encounter, and the normal sounds and sensations of driving were comforting. I'd made it maybe 10 miles when I saw them again. This time they appeared more gradually, starting as a faint glow in my mirror that slowly resolved into those same two perfectly steady points of light. My heart rate picked up immediately, and I felt my palms grow damp against the steering wheel. They settled into that familiar position about a quarter mile behind me, matching my speed with that same unnatural precision. This time, I was determined to get some answers. I began varying my speed more dramatically, slowing down to 55, then accelerating to 75. The lights matched every change instantly, as if they were reading my intentions rather than reacting to my actions. I tried sudden lane changes, moving left and right within my lane, but they followed each movement perfectly. The landscape around us had changed from farmland to a more wooded area, with tall pines pressing close to the highway on both sides. The darkness between the trees seemed absolute, and I found myself focusing intently on the road ahead, trying not to think about what might be lurking in those shadows. The lights behind me had become a constant presence, and I was beginning to feel like prey being stalked by something patient and persistent. As I crested a small hill, I saw something that made me tap the brakes instinctively. About half a mile ahead, another set of headlights was approaching from the opposite direction. This was my chance to see what would happen when the mysterious lights encountered another vehicle. I watched my mirrors carefully as the oncoming car drew closer. The moment the approaching vehicle came into view of whatever was following me, the lights behind me simply vanished. 1 second they were there, steady as always, and the next second, there was nothing but empty highway in my mirrors. The oncoming car passed me normally, just a sedan with a lone driver who probably had no idea what had just occurred. I drove the remaining 20 miles to Carson in a state of heightened alertness, checking my mirrors constantly, but the lights didn't return. When I finally reached the dealer where I was making the sign that never says stop, from Marcus Shen. I've been driving long haul for 15 years now, and in that time I've seen plenty of things that would make most folks question their sanity. Desert mirages that look like oasis towns, phantom headlights in your mirrors that vanish when you check your blind spots, and radio static that sounds almost like voices calling your name. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on that rain-soaked stretch of Highway 34 through eastern Montana last October. The evening started normal enough. I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Billings to Minneapolis, running about 2 hours behind schedule thanks to a blown tire outside of Miles City. My rig, a midnight blue Peterbilt 389 that I had been driving for the better part of 8 years, was purring like a giant mechanical cat as we rolled through the gathering dusk. The steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me was almost hypnotic, mixing with the rhythmic whisper of tires on wet asphalt to create that familiar symphony that had lulled me through countless nights on the road. The weather had been threatening all day, with heavy gray clouds building up like mountains in the sky, and by the time I reached the outskirts of Circle, Montana, the first fat raindrops were spattering against my windshield. Within minutes, what started as a gentle shower had escalated into a proper downpour, the kind that turns your windshield wipers into metronomes marking time against the storm. I reached over and cranked up the defrost, watching the fog clear from the glass in slow, expanding circles. That's when I first saw it. Standing at the intersection of Highway 34 and some unnamed county road was a stop sign that seemed perfectly ordinary at first glance. Standard octagonal shape, reflective red surface with white lettering, mounted on a galvanized steel post, just like thousands of others scattered across the American highway system. Nothing remarkable about it whatsoever, except for the fact that as my headlight swept across its surface, the retro-reflective material seemed to glow with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The bright red seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, drawing my attention back to it even as I continued past the intersection. I shook my head and focused on the road ahead. Long-haul driving can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're tired and fighting against schedule pressure. The human brain, deprived of stimulation during those endless hours of highway hypnosis, tends to create its own entertainment, finding patterns and significance in the most mundane objects. I'd seen truckers convinced that billboards were following them, or that certain mile markers appeared more frequently than they should. This was probably just another case of road fatigue, making the ordinary seem extraordinary. But 20 miles later, when I crested a small hill and saw my headlights illuminate another intersection, there it was again. The same stop sign, or at least one that looked identical to it, standing at the corner of Highway 34 and another county road. Same perfect octagonal shape, same almost aggressive brightness when the light hit it, same unsettling way of drawing my attention even after I'd passed it by. This time, I found myself checking my rearview mirrors, watching as the sign's red glow faded into the darkness behind me. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof of my cab with increasing intensity. My windshield wipers were working overtime, their rubber blades squeaking slightly against the glass in a rhythm that was beginning to sound almost like whispered words. I reached for my CB radio and switched it on, hoping to hear some chatter from other drivers, but all I got was static, punctuated by the occasional burst of what might have been Spanish or might have been just atmospheric interference. Another 15 miles rolled by beneath my wheels, the highway stretching out ahead of me like a black ribbon in the cone of my headlights. The landscape around me was typical Montana rangeland, rolling hills dotted with the occasional ranch building or grain silo, all of it rendered invisible by the darkness and the steadily falling rain. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, my engine temperature was running normal, and according to my GPS, I was making decent time despite the weather. Everything was exactly as it should be on a routine run through Big Sky Country, except for the stop sign that appeared at the next intersection. This time I actually slowed down as I approached it, my air brakes hissing softly as I brought the big rig down from highway speed. In the wash of my headlights, the sign looked absolutely identical to the previous two. Same mounting height, same angle relative to the road, same almost mirror-bright reflectivity that made the red surface seem to glow from within. But what really caught my attention was something I hadn't noticed before. The metal post supporting the sign was slightly bent, kinked about 3 feet from the base, as if someone had backed into it with a vehicle and then straightened it out imperfectly. I was certain, absolutely certain, that the previous two signs had shown exactly the same damage. As I rolled through the intersection, I made a mental note of the mile marker I'd just passed. Mile marker 247, according to the small green sign barely visible in the sweep of my headlights. If I encountered another stop sign, I'd be able to calculate the spacing and figure out if there was some pattern I was missing, some logical explanation for what was beginning to feel like a very illogical situation. The next sign appeared at mile marker 261, exactly 14 miles later. Same intersection layout, same bent post, same unnaturally bright reflectivity that seemed to pulse just at the edge of perception. By now, my hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and I could feel a thin line of sweat forming along my hairline, despite the cool air conditioning blowing from the vents. When I tried the CB radio again, the static seemed louder, more insistent, almost like the sound of rain falling on metal. I began to pay closer attention to my surroundings, looking for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. Road construction signs, detour markers, anything that might indicate I was driving in circles or had somehow gotten turned around without realizing it. But my GPS showed a perfectly straight line along Highway 34, mile markers counting upward in proper sequence, estimated arrival time in Minneapolis, updating normally as I maintained my eastward progress. The fourth stop sign appeared precisely 14 miles after the third, and by then I was no longer trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Instead, I was beginning to feel the first cold fingers of genuine fear creeping up my spine. There was something profoundly wrong with the way that sign seemed to command attention, the way its red surface appeared to pulse with its own internal light, the way my eyes kept being drawn back to it in my rearview mirrors long after I should have lost sight of it in the darkness. When I saw the fifth sign, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity, if not my life. Instead of driving past it as I had the others, I pulled onto the shoulder about 100 yards before the intersection and brought my rig to a complete stop. The engine idled with its familiar rumbling growl while I sat there in the cab, rain hammering against the windshield and the stop sign glowing like a red beacon in the distance ahead. I reached for my logbook and flipped to a clean page, then began sketching what I could see of the sign and the intersection layout. As I drew, I noticed details that my conscious mind had been trying to ignore. The way the sign seemed to be perfectly positioned to catch my headlights regardless of the angle of approach. The way no other traffic signs were visible at any of these intersections, as if the stop sign existed in isolation. The way the county roads that intersected with the highway seemed to fade into absolute blackness just beyond the range of my lights, as if they led nowhere at all. That's when I heard the tapping. It started as a soft rhythmic sound, barely audible above the rain and the engine noise. Tap, 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 like someone gently knocking on metal. I looked around the cab, checking the windows, the doors, the instrument panel, but everything appeared normal. The sound continued, growing slightly louder and more insistent with each repetition. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. I suddenly realized that the sound was coming from outside, from somewhere behind the truck. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I opened the driver's side door and stepped down into the rain, my boots splashing in the puddles that had formed alongside the highway. The cold October air hit me like a physical shock, and within seconds my clothes were soaked through. The tapping was definitely coming from the back of the trailer, a steady metallic percussion that cut through the white noise of the storm. I made my way along the length of the truck, my flashlight beam dancing across the wet metal surfaces, until I reached the rear doors of the trailer. The sound was loudest here, as if someone or something was inside the cargo compartment, knocking against the walls with deliberate, measured strikes. But that was impossible. I had locked the trailer myself back in Billings, and I carried the only key. My hand trembled as I reached for the heavy padlock securing the trailer doors. The metal was ice cold beneath my fingers, and as I inserted the key, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain drumming against metal and the distant idle of my diesel engine. I hesitated for a long moment, key halfway turned, every survival instinct I possessed screaming at me to walk away, to get back in the cab, to drive until I reached civilization and pretend none of this had ever happened. Instead, I turned the key the rest of the way and heard the lock click open. The trailer doors swung outward with a metallic groan, revealing the dark interior of the cargo compartment. My flashlight beam swept across the familiar shapes of construction equipment strapped down with heavy cargo nets, a small excavator, welding equipment, toolboxes, all exactly as I had loaded them nearly 8 hours ago. Nothing appeared disturbed, nothing seemed out of place, and certainly nothing that could have been producing that rhythmic tapping sound. But as I played the light across the interior walls of the trailer, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Scratched into the metal surface, barely visible in the dancing beam of my flashlight, were dozens of tally marks. Simple vertical lines grouped in fives, as if someone had been keeping count of something. Days, perhaps? Or occurrences. The scratches looked fresh, the metal around them still bright where it had been scraped away. I had never seen those marks before. As I stood there, staring at the evidence of something impossible, the tapping began again, but this time, it wasn't coming from inside the trailer. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the intersection where that damned stop sign continued to glow in the rain. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was getting closer. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but all I could see was the empty highway, stretching away in both directions, and that infernal red sign pulsing like a beacon at the intersection ahead. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, seeming to echo from the metal guardrails, from the asphalt itself, from the very air around me. That's when I saw the footprints. They appeared in my flashlight beam as if materializing from the darkness itself. Wet boot prints leading from the intersection toward my truck, each one filled with rainwater and reflecting the light like tiny mirrors. The prints were roughly my size, with the same tread pattern as the steel-toed work boots I was wearing, but I hadn't walked from the intersection. I had approached from the opposite direction, from the west. The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the distant rumble of my engine, I heard something far worse than any mysterious noise. I heard my own voice, calling out from somewhere in the darkness near the stop sign. "Marcus," the voice said, and it was unmistakably mine, with the same slight rasp I'd developed after years of chain smoking during my younger days. "Marcus, over here." Ran. There's no shame in admitting it, and anyone who says they would have done differently is either lying or has never faced something that challenges every assumption they have about how the world works. I ran back to my cab, slammed the trailer doors shut without bothering to lock them, and had the truck in gear before I was fully seated behind the wheel. The Peterbilt roared to life as I floored the accelerator, 18 wheels finding purchase on the wet asphalt as we lurched forward into the night. In my mirrors I caught a glimpse of a figure standing near the stop sign, a man in a blue work shirt and jeans, who might have been my twin brother, waving at me with slow, deliberate movements as if encouraging me to return. I didn't look back again. For the next 50 miles, I drove like a man possessed, pushing the big rig harder than I had any right to on those rain-slicked roads. My speedometer needle hovered near 80, well above the speed limit, and certainly faster than any sane person would drive an 18-wheeler through a Montana thunderstorm. But sanity had become a relative concept, and all I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that intersection. When I finally saw the lights of Glendive in the distance, I nearly wept with relief. Real lights belonging to real buildings where real people lived their normal, everyday lives without being stalked by impossible stop signs and doppelgangers made of rain and shadow. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, engine off, hands shaking as I tried to process what had happened. I never finished that run to Minneapolis. Instead, I called my dispatcher from the truck stop payphone and told him I was sick, that I needed someone else to complete the delivery. The trailer and its cargo made it to Minneapolis 3 days later, delivered by another driver who reported nothing unusual about the journey except for some unexplained scratches on the interior walls that weren't mentioned in the original damage report. I never drove Highway 34 through eastern Montana again. But sometimes, on dark nights when the rain is coming down hard and I'm running a route through unfamiliar territory, I catch glimpses of red octagons in my peripheral vision. Stop signs that seem to glow just a little too brightly, positioned at intersections that don't quite match my GPS display. When that happens, I take the next exit, find an alternate route, and try not to think about the sound of tapping metal or the sight of my own face waving at me from the darkness beside a road that leads nowhere at all. The company psychologist I was required to see after my incident report called it highway hypnosis, complicated by fatigue-induced hallucinations. The official accident report listed driver exhaustion as the cause of my failure to complete the assigned route. My insurance premiums went up and I had to attend a weekend seminar on recognizing the signs of driver fatigue. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere out there on Highway 34, between mile markers that might not exist on any official survey, there's a stop sign that never says stop. It says something else entirely. Something that scratches tally marks on trailer walls and calls to drivers with voices that sound exactly like their own. Some roads are meant to be traveled only once. Others are meant to be avoided altogether. Highway 34 through eastern Montana is definitely the latter. Marcus Chen retired from long-haul trucking in 2018 and now operates a small auto repair shop in Billings, Montana. He has never returned to Highway 34. The Freight Manifest from 1972. From Charlie Brennan. The yellowed paper crackled between my fingers as I pulled it from the glove compartment of the ancient Peterbilt I had just inherited from my uncle's estate. The manifest was dated September 15, 1972, and written in that precise, careful handwriting that belonged to a generation before typewriters became commonplace in trucking offices. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but I could still make out the cargo details. 12 wooden crates, contents confidential, pickup Denver, delivery Tucson. What struck me as odd was the delivery date, listed as September 22, 1972, but according to the shipping company stamp in the corner, the cargo had never been delivered. I had been driving long haul for 15 years, but this old rig was something special. Uncle Marcus had bought it new in '71, and somehow it still ran like a dream, despite having over 2 million miles on the odometer. The engine had that deep, throaty rumble that modern diesels just couldn't match, and the cab smelled of old leather, motor oil, and decades of truck stop coffee. Marcus had always been secretive about his routes and cargo, keeping to himself at family gatherings and never talking shop like most drivers do. When he passed last month, he left me the truck and a storage unit in Denver with a note that simply read, "Finish what I started." The storage unit had been easy enough to find using the key Marcus left me. Inside, covered by a canvas tarp that must have been nearly as old as the truck itself, sat 12 wooden crates that matched the description on the manifest exactly. They were built from rough pine, secured with old-fashioned metal latches, and each one was about the size of a large suitcase. No shipping labels, no markings except for a small symbol burned into the wood that looked like a stylized eye surrounded by curved lines. The crates were surprisingly heavy when I loaded them into the trailer, and they made no sound when I shook them gently, as if whatever was inside was packed tightly or secured in place. The drive south from Denver started normally enough. I-25 stretched ahead of me in the late afternoon sun, the familiar rhythm of the road helping to settle my nerves about taking on this mysterious final job of Uncle Marcus's. The Peterbilt pulled the load easily, the engine humming with that low, constant note that puts a driver into a meditative state after hours behind the wheel. Traffic was light for a Tuesday, just the usual mix of commuters heading home and fellow truckers making their runs. I planned to drive through the night and be in Tucson by morning, finally closing the book on whatever strange business my uncle had left unfinished. As the sun began setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the high desert landscape, I noticed something peculiar in my mirrors. The same blue sedan had been following me for the past 50 miles, maintaining exactly the same distance behind my trailer. It wasn't unusual for cars to get stuck behind trucks on the 2-lane stretches, but this one never made any attempt to pass, even when opportunities presented themselves. The windows were tinted too dark to see the driver, and something about the way it held its position made my skin crawl slightly. I tried changing lanes and adjusting my speed, but the car matched every movement perfectly, like it was tethered to my truck by an invisible rope. When I stopped at a truck stop outside Santa Fe for fuel and a meal, the blue sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped at the far end, near the edge of the property where the security lights barely reached. I walked over after fueling, thinking I'd introduce myself and maybe find out what was going on, but as I approached, the car's engine started and it pulled away, without the driver ever stepping out. The whole interaction left me with an uncomfortable feeling that crawled up my spine and settled at the base of my skull like a persistent headache. Back on the road, I tried to shake off the uneasiness by focusing on the familiar comfort of night driving. There's something peaceful about rolling down an empty highway with just your headlights cutting through the darkness, the radio playing softly, and the steady drone of the engine creating a cocoon of sound that separates you from the rest of the world. The stars were brilliant in the clear desert sky, and a quarter moon provided just enough light to silhouette the mesa formations and scattered juniper trees that dotted the landscape. For a while, I almost forgot about the mysterious cargo in my trailer and the strange car that had been following me. But as I crossed into New Mexico and the highway became more isolated, things began to feel wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The radio started picking up strange interference, voices speaking in what sounded like Spanish, but with an odd cadence that made the hair on my arms stand up. The static would come and go in waves, sometimes clear enough to almost understand, other times dissolving into white noise, punctuated by what sounded like crying or laughing. I switched between different stations, but the interference followed every frequency, as if it was coming from inside the truck rather than over the airwaves. The blue sedan had reappeared in my mirrors about an hour after the truck stop, resuming its precise following distance. But now I noticed other cars as well, all maintaining the same spacing, all with windows too dark to see inside. A black pickup truck, a white van, a silver SUV, all following in a loose convoy that stayed exactly the same distance behind me no matter what I did. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they matched my speed perfectly. It was like driving in the center of some invisible formation, and the feeling was becoming genuinely frightening. Around midnight, I started hearing sounds from the trailer. At first I thought it might be the cargo shifting as we went around curves or hit bumps in the road, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. It sounded like tapping, as if someone or something inside the crates was gently but persistently knocking against the wood. The tapping would start and stop in patterns that almost seemed like communication, like Morse code or some other system of signals. I pulled over at a rest area to check the trailer, but everything looked normal from the outside. The crates were still strapped down securely, and there was no sign that anything had shifted or broken loose. As I stood there in the pool of harsh fluorescent light from the rest area's security flags, the convoy of following cars passed by slowly on the highway, their headlights sweeping across me like searchlights. But instead of continuing down the road, they pulled into turnouts and side roads just beyond the rest area, positioning themselves to resume following when I got back on the highway. The coordination was too perfect to be coincidental, and I realized that whatever was happening had been planned long before I'd inherited this truck and taken on this cargo. Getting back behind the wheel, I noticed that the old manifest from the glove compartment was now sitting on the passenger's seat, even though I was certain I'd put it back where I found it. The paper seemed to glow slightly in the dashboard lights, and as I picked it up, I saw that new writing had appeared below the original shipping information, in the same careful handwriting as the original manifest. Someone or something had added, "Delivery delayed 49 years. Cargo remains viable. Complete delivery to preserve agreement." The ink looked fresh, as if it had been written moments before, but there was no way anyone could have gotten into the truck while I was checking the trailer. The tapping from the cargo area was getting louder and more insistent as I pulled back onto the highway, and now it was joined by other sounds that made my blood run cold. Low moaning, like wind through a cave, but coming from inside the wooden crates. Whispers in languages I didn't recognize, speaking words that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The temperature in the cab began dropping despite the heater running full blast, and my breath started forming small clouds as I exhaled. The steering wheel grew cold under my hands, and frost began forming on the inside of the windshield in patterns that looked almost like writing. The convoy following me had grown to over a dozen vehicles now, all maintaining their precise formation like they were being controlled by a single mind. Their headlights created a river of light in my mirrors that stretched back until it disappeared into the darkness, and I began to understand that I wasn't just delivering cargo. I was part of something much larger and more terrifying than a simple trucking job. Whatever my uncle had agreed to transport in 1972 had been waiting patiently for nearly 5 decades, and now it was finally going to reach its destination. As the lights of Tucson began appearing on the horizon, the sounds from the cargo area reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache. The tapping had become pounding, as if whatever was inside the crates was desperate to get out, and the whispers had grown into a chorus of voices speaking in unison. The convoy following me began flashing their lights in patterns that seemed to correspond with the sounds coming from my trailer, as if they were somehow communicating with my cargo. I found the delivery address from the manifest, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city, sitting in an industrial district where the streetlights were few and far between. The building looked abandoned at first glance, with broken windows and weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock, but as I maneuvered my truck into position, lights began appearing in the windows, one by one, as if the building were waking up in anticipation of my arrival. The convoy had followed me all the way to the warehouse, and now the vehicles were arranging themselves in a perfect circle around the loading dock, their headlights all pointing inward like the spokes of a wheel. The drivers remained invisible behind their tinted windows, but I could feel their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The sounds from my trailer had reached an almost unbearable volume, and the wooden crates were shaking hard enough to rock the entire truck from side to side. A man emerged from the warehouse as I climbed down from the cab. He was elderly, maybe in his 70s, wearing a simple gray suit that looked like it might have been fashionable in 1972. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and alert, and he moved with the confident stride of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. In his hand, he carried a clipboard with papers that looked identical to the manifest I'd found in Uncle Marcus's glove compartment. "Charlie Brennan," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the loading dock despite the cacophony coming from my trailer. "Your uncle spoke of you often. He said you would come when the time was right." He held up the clipboard, and I could see that it contained shipping documents dating back decades, all with the same careful handwriting, all bearing the same strange eye symbol. "These deliveries have been waiting for completion for nearly 50 years. The agreement your uncle made required a blood relative to finish what he started." I wanted to ask what kind of agreement, what was in the crates, why the convoy had followed me, but the words wouldn't come. The old man gestured toward the warehouse doors, which were now standing open to reveal a loading area filled with people in gray clothing, all standing perfectly still, all watching me with the same intense focus I'd felt from the convoy drivers. They began moving toward my truck in unison, their footsteps perfectly synchronized, and I realized they were going to unload the cargo whether I cooperated or not. The crates were heavier than they had been in Denver, requiring 4 people each to carry them into the warehouse. As they were moved, the eye symbols burned into the wood began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of the sounds coming from inside. The convoy vehicles began honking their horns in the same rhythm, creating a symphony of mechanical and otherworldly noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the warehouse. When the last crate disappeared into the building, the old man approached me again with a small envelope. "Your uncle's final payment," he said, handing it to me. "The agreement is complete. You may go now, but remember, some contracts extend beyond a single lifetime. Your children, when you have them, may find themselves called to similar service." Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $50,000, dated September 22, 1972, but somehow still valid despite being nearly 50 years old. Attached to it was a note in Uncle Marcus's handwriting. "Charlie, I'm sorry to have involved you in this, but some debts can only be paid by family. Use the money wisely and pray your children never inherit what I couldn't finish. The Watchers will be in touch if they need you again." As I drove away from the warehouse, the convoy vehicles fell away one by one, disappearing into side streets and industrial lots until I was alone again on the highway. The old Peterbilt ran quieter now, as if some burden had been lifted from its engine, and the radio picked up normal stations without any interference. The frost on the windshield melted away, and the temperature in the cab returned to normal. But in my rearview mirror, I could see the warehouse glowing, with that same pulsing light as the eye symbols on the crates, and I knew that whatever had been delivered that night was now where it belonged. The thought should have comforted me, but instead it filled me with a deep, persistent dread that has never completely gone away. I still drive long haul, but I've never taken another job that didn't come through legitimate channels, and I've never again found mysterious manifests in glove compartments or inherited cargo that defied explanation. The $50,000 paid for a house in a quiet suburb where I met my wife and started a family. But sometimes late at night, when my children are sleeping, I find myself checking the locks on all the doors and wondering if the Watchers are still out there, waiting for the next generation to honor agreements made long before they were born. The old Peterbilt sits in my garage now, covered by a tarp and disconnected from its battery. I tell myself it's just nostalgic sentiment that keeps me from selling it, but the truth is simpler and more frightening. Some vehicles carry more than just cargo. They carry obligations that pass from one generation to the next, and I suspect that truck will be needed again someday, when another member of my family receives a call to finish what someone else started. Until then, it waits, and so do I.